On behalf of the Irish Forum for International Agricultural Development, IFIAD, I'd like to welcome you all to this year's annual IFIAD conference. My name is Charlie Splan. I'm the chair of IFIAD. For those of you who may not be familiar with IFIAD, IFIAD was first established in 2016 with the mission to develop partnerships of excellence for the generation, sharing and application of experience, knowledge and innovation in agriculture for development. So IFIAD is a truly multidisciplinary and intersectoral national forum which is bringing together at this point all of the institutions, the organizations and individuals in Ireland who are engaged in international agricultural development. For any of you who are not yet a member of IFIAD, we'd really encourage you to join IFIAD, and you can go to our website, which is www.ifiad.ie, and you can join IFIAD. So we're a very open forum essentially. So you're all very welcome, and we've over 200 people registered and online for today's annual conference. This is our first annual conference. It's our 5th conference to date in this series. We have a wide range of participants from both Ireland and overseas, and across a wide range of organisations and perspectives. So welcome to you all, and I hope we have an exciting and vibrant conference today. So before I introduce the topic of today's conference, I'd like to express our thanks to the IFIAD Conference Organising Committee, which has consisted of Isabella Ray, Paul Wagstaff, Michael O'Brien and Chris Somerville and myself, and then also to Patrice Lucid and Isabel McLaughlin for their hard work in putting together the background and the organisation of leading up to today's conference. We're also very thankful to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney, who's also our Minister for Defence. He's going to take time from his busy schedule to address our conference today, so he'll be joining us later. And thanks also to Irish Aid and the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine in Ireland for their continuing support to IFIAD and all of our colleagues on the IFIAD Steering Committee. And finally, a major thanks to our speakers for taking time from their busy schedules for today's event. So just to speak to the topic for a few moments, just to kind of frame the conference. The theme of this year's IFIAD conference is COVID-19 and sustainable food systems, transforming food systems in times of crisis. And we've invited some of the world's leading authorities on sustainable food systems to provide a diversity of viewpoints and perspectives. So over the past year, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has spread to every inhabited quarter of our planet. And the virus has now infected over 40 million people, 1.1 million COVID-related deaths, and is placing unprecedented stresses on our public health systems, and particularly impacting on the poor and most vulnerable in our societies. And as the suppression measures to limit the spread of the virus, they're really testing the resilience of our societies and economies. And we should consider that the pandemic is now posing major challenges for reaching the targets of the SDGs, particularly the Agenda 2030 ambition of leaving no one behind. So our conference today is looking at the intersection and the impact of COVID-19 on our food systems. We're going to hear about near-term and long-term impacts of COVID-19 on our food systems. We'll also hear about what we're learning about how to make our food systems more resilient to shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic. A key question for us is, how can these learnings inform transformation pathways for our food systems to more sustainable futures? And if we look at such futures in today's conference, we're also going to look at the prospects for improved EU-Africa partnerships, with a particular focus on the EU's Task Force for Rural Africa and Ireland's response, future plans in this arena. The Building Back Better concept has emerged from the disaster risk reduction arena, and where they speak to the opportunities that arise in the wake of a disaster for building to more resilient societies and economies. And the world, in a similar vein, the World Economic Forum is highlighting the possibilities for a great reset of our economies and societies to make them more resilient to future shocks. So in today's IFIAD conference, I'd urge us all to consider what the prospects and opportunities are for building back better to more sustainable, equitable and resilient food systems. And we'll hear from our excellent panel of speakers in relation to the opportunities and what can be considered in that regard. So the agenda for today's conference was 2 sessions. First session is on COVID-19 learning in a crisis, transitioning to resilient food systems. We have a series of speakers, and we're going to hear from different perspectives, from nutrition, climate change, justice and equality, land rights and tenure. Firstly, we'll have Johan Swinnen, who's Director General of IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. Then we have Karina Hawkes from City University of London, Sonia Vermeulen from the CGIAR, Melissa Leach from the IFIDS Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, Mike Taylor from the International Land Coalition, and then also Martin Frick, who's special envoy to the UN Food Systems Summit. Then we'll transition over to session 2, which takes more of a focus on EU-Africa partnerships, looking to the future. We'll have an address from our Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence, Simon Coveney, TD, and that'll be followed by Tom Arnold, who's the chair of the National Task Team on Rural Africa, and who will give us an update on the work of that group over the past year. Then we'll have perspectives and responses from Leonard Mitzi from DG DevCo in Brussels, Francesco Rampa from the European Centre for Development Policy Management, Jane Musindi from the private sector perspective, the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, and then we have Fatma Ben Rajeb, who's the CEO of the Pan-African Farmers Organization, and Million Billet from the African Food Sovereignty Alliance. And then we'll have questions and answers, and we'll have a wrap up by myself and the moderator. We would really encourage the online participants to really engage in the conference, to post your questions to the panelists, to the speakers, and the moderator will relay those questions to the speakers. So we'd like to get a lot of engagement. For those of you on social media, we'd encourage you to use the hashtag IFIAD20 for this year's conference. The conference will be recorded and placed on IFIAD's YouTube channel. And then to conclude, I'd like to hope that we all have a wonderful conference. And I'd like to hand you over to Ella McSweeney, who's our moderator for today. Ella's Ireland's leading food and farming journalist, and she will be moderating the proceedings. So thank you all, and let's have a good conference.
Thank you so much, Charles. And I'm just delighted to be here this morning, and I'm really looking forward to what I think is going to be a really stimulating and engaging morning of talks and discussions. So a very big welcome to everyone who's logged on and is watching. And Charles has given you a very clear outline of what's happening in this morning's schedule. So I'm not going to duplicate that. I'm going to keep things rolling, other than just to emphasize and ask you to please take a look, as Charles said, at the live chat function of the YouTube live stream to post your questions. We really want as many of you as possible to put questions and to engage with the incredible lineup of panelists and speakers that we have. And I think that, that kind of engagement will ensure an insightful and lively discussion this morning. And I will make sure to do my best to put as many of those questions as I can to everyone. But my aim this morning is to keep things moving. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. His name is Dr. Johan Swinnen. He's the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute. He's published very extensively on food and agricultural policies, international development, political economy, global value chains and trade. His recent book, The Political Economy of Agricultural and Food Policies, won the 2019 Book Award from the European Association of Agricultural Economists. So we're delighted to have him here this morning. And he's going to present on global stocktake on COVID-19 and sustainable food systems. So I'm going to pass over to you, Johan.
Thank you very much, Ella. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I'm really very delighted to be here at the annual conference of IFIAD. I mean, IFIAD has been a very strong supporter of IFPRI throughout the years, and we really very much appreciate that support. It's been very important and very valuable to us. I think you have a very impressive set of speakers on the panel, the first one and the second one. And so my introduction will be more of a stock-taking nature. We will focus on what we have learned over the past month about the interaction between COVID-19 and global food systems. For this, I will draw very heavily on our research at IFPRI, which has used a combination of different methodologies. We have global models, we have national models, we have different ways of collecting evidence, which is actually what's going on in the field right now. We collected a lot of that material in an ebook, which we brought out in August, and that's freely available on our website, on the IFPRI website. You can download it from there. And so I have summarized some of that and some updated material, which is because a lot of the new insights are coming out right now, actually. And so I've basically in a set of slides, although there is, I got 50 minutes, which seems like eternity in this new world where all the presentations are usually condensed to 5 minutes now. There is still so much you can do. And I may skip a few slides, but they are available for you. Okay, let me again go to the first slide, which kind of summarizes, I think, in terms of the impact of COVID on our food systems. And next slide, please. And basically what we know now is that COVID-19 affects the food and nutrition systems through multiple channels. Okay, and probably the two most important ones are the impact on incomes and employment, so the economic recession effects. And the second one is it is disrupting the food systems, the supply chains, etc. Now, what's important is that these effects are multiple, okay? So that means you have to address multiple channels if you want to solve the problem. At the same time, they're very heterogeneous in their effect. They're not affecting everybody equally. And we know that particularly labor-intensive nodes in supply chain and food systems are affected most strongly, and this affects obviously developing countries, poor countries, more because they are more labor-intensive. Their systems are more labor-intensive than rich countries. Next slide, please. On the next slide, I'm summarized a few things coming out of our model assessments. And so on the left panel, you see the impact or impact assessments on global poverty. And there we estimate that under certain conditions, without massive interventions, we estimate that up to 150 people can fall back in extreme poverty or already falling back in extreme poverty. And most of these are located in sub-Saharan Africa. On the right panel, you can see that that the impact on nutrition is very strong as well, in addition to the poverty effect, which is clearly a shift from more nutritious foods, which is typically more expensive and sometimes also more vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, such as fruit and vegetables and animal products, to basic staples. Next slide, please. If we look at a number of assessments in terms of what we estimate the impact, so these are average per month of lockdown impacts on GDP and poverty, and you see these effects are very strong, okay? So we see declines by between 25 and 40% of changes in country GDP, and in terms of increases in poverty, they vary between 10 and 17%. In these different developing and emerging countries. Okay, these are large effects. Next slide, please. Now, as I said already, the impact is unequal in the sense that, and we know that poor people are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, and that is not true for one reason. It's true to a combination of factors. One is poor people typically spend a much larger share of their income on food than rich people do. Poor people's main production factor is physical labor, okay? So my labor is, I'm sitting here talking to you behind my computer so I can work from my office without having to go outside. That's not true for poor people. They typically don't have highly skilled labor, they don't have buildings, they don't have land, and so their asset is physical labor, and that's the one which is most affected both by the disease itself and by the restrictions imposed through the policies. Poor people are also more, their private food value chains are more disrupted because they're typically more labor intense, but also their public value chains, if you want, are more disrupted because they're more dependent on social and nutrition programs. And of course, they have less access to health services. And we see that among the poor people, even there's a distinction between some groups, and we find particularly that children, women, and for people who depend on migration for their incomes are most affected. Next slide, please. There is a reason, okay, so these are basically recent survey data that come in from Ethiopia, where we find that indeed the data that we collect now is consistent with these arguments that I just made. So the left panel shows income declines for different groups in the country. These are data from Addis Ababa, from the capital, and you see that the poorest segment of the population there is mostly affected both by income declines and by reduction in nutritious foods. In this case, it's dairy consumption. Next slide, please. There are a number of reasons why women are especially vulnerable. So COVID-19 has gendered effects in terms of health effects, in terms of the income shocks, and in terms of the impact on empowerment, children's schooling, etc., which may have very important long-term effects on gender. And therefore, in a series of blogs that IFPRI Research have done, they have basically emphasized that it's really important that if you want to address these things, that you should take into account these gender effects and to adapt or specify the policies so that they take account of this. In the next slide, we have some results from our work in Myanmar. And there, the fall in remittances is really a big part of the income and unemployment effect in many developing countries. And there we see that the impact in rural areas or rural households is more than twice as big as in urban households. And that for rural female-headed households, that's a gender effect, the effect is more than 3 times as much than in urban households. So this clearly confirms our expectations on strong gender effect. Next slide, please. Here we have some results of our work on where we look at, okay, so how is agriculture and the food system affected compared to the rest of the economy? And I will first look at the sectoral effect. The next slide is on the food systems effect. And essentially, just summarizing this, is that we see that agriculture as a sector is affected actually in terms of GDP, the effect and income going down, less than industry and less than services, okay? But if you look at the agri-food system as a whole, there you see the same thing within the agri-food system. So here on the left panel is data from Nigeria. You see that the total decline is almost 40%. Agri-food system is only half of that, 18%, but that's because agriculture, farming itself, is relatively, I mean, a 14% decline, and it's big, okay? So I don't really, do not misinterpret my words, but compared to what's happening on the processing side, and particularly the food services side, it is relatively less than that, okay? Now, of course, these are in a way short-run effects, and it may be that the agricultural impacts may be significantly larger in the longer run, depending on access to seeds, fertilizer for the next growing season, etc. But you see that both in Myanmar and Nigeria, the same story comes back, if you want. Next slide, please. There has been, as you all know, there has been a significant amount of reactions by governments and international agencies and development agencies. And so there's different types of policy responses that we observe. Some have to do with addressing the health problems directly, movement control, whatever. Otherwise, others have to do with trying to protect the people against the impacts of COVID and the lockdowns. And so we have fiscal and financial measures, social protection measures, and then there's a number of other measures that we've seen. Let me just briefly go through 3 sets of these. The first one is about the trade one. Next slide, please. So the first trade response that we saw globally is the trade restrictions, which have been implemented by many of the main food exporters, particularly staple food exporters in the world. And so there, I think the good and the bad thing on this story is that the bad thing is that they almost immediately introduced these trade restrictions, which were worsening the problem for many poor countries which are importing some of these foods. But at the same time, we saw there was a very rapid reaction from international organizations like the WTO, the G20, FAO, etc., calling for basically saying this is really not a good measure. And what is interesting is that governments actually responded to this by removing several of these constraints, also because the arguments why it was not a good reaction, I think, were powerful, pointing out that the stocks were, food stocks in the world were relatively high, definitely much higher than in 2007, 2008, when we saw the big food price spike before. Next slide, please. What we also see is that African countries or developing countries in general, these are data from African countries, have responded with a lot of interventions which are affecting trade within their country and across African borders. And so on the left-hand side, you see a panel. And so these are data from essentially from 2 weeks, almost 10 days in March. And there you see that essentially all the African countries are closing their borders for trade or making border traffic much more difficult. Okay, and this had all kinds of implications for food security, both internally in the countries and of course in terms of international intra-Africa trade. Next slide, please. The other thing what we have seen, and this is a very welcome effect, I think, or a very positive thing, is that we've seen a fairly massive expansion of social protection measures, both by scaling up social protection measures that already existed in the country, by keeping them there, and by introducing new ones. Okay, and so at IFPRI we have, at the World Bank and at IFPRI we have a portal where we collect information on these things. And on the right panel, you see that most of these social protection policies is, as one would expect, targeted to low-income groups of society. And on the left-hand panel, you see the types of social protection measures that have been introduced. A significant part is through food aid, others through cash transfer, wage support, etc. It's a combination of different effects. Next slide, please. The other question, I think this is a really important question for us moving forward on this: how resilient have supply chains and food systems been? And there, I think the question there's a lot of discussion right now, and it's been brought up in many debates and many policy fora on the global versus the local supply chains or food systems, right? And so I think there the evidence on what has been most resilient is actually very much out there. I think we have a lot of ad hoc stories about how certain supply chains have been quite resilient, how other ones have not been resilient. But how this is related to the structure of the supply chain is actually quite heterogeneous. Some of the global supply chains have held up very well, some have not held up well. Local supply chains, and of course, how do you define local? Is local mean from a village next to the city, or is local means within a country? But then if you think about a country like India, I mean, trade within a country is just, I mean, these are huge differences with many interactions. So I think that the conclusions there are much more nuanced and mixed than is showing up in the discussion. And this is, of course, important moving forward. I already talked about the labor versus the capital intensity, which is different. And also there, of course, large scale versus small scale companies in the supply chain, short run effects versus longer run effects. We definitely see significant difference in the dynamics, okay, and that quite a lot of the disruptions were clearly short-run disruptions, and there's been a lot of innovation in the supply chain which has taken place to overcome these disruptions. And you see the resilience is already being much stronger now than it was a few months ago. And there's also differences clearly among, it's a bit more difficult for perishables than for crops that can be stored more easily. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this kind of comes back to it. What we do see, and I'm glad that Karina is on the program here, because she gave a great presentation a couple of weeks ago at IFPRI, and she wrote a blog following up on that, on innovations in public supply chains, okay, and social organizations coming together to come up with ways to overcome these. What we also see, there's a lot of innovation going on right now in private supply chains to make the supply chains more better able to deal with the COVID impacts and the policy responses to COVID. And so these innovations, one of the elements of that is that we clearly see digital growth in the sense there's a lot of introduction of ICT solutions, e-commerce showing up even in poor countries, and certainly in emerging and middle income countries. But there's also a lot of basically restructuring of the way you do business, the way you interact with each other, restructuring of the organization of your activities, etc. And so in a way, these things are already very much working on creating more resilient. And when you talk to some of the people in the field, they tend to say, well, you know, the innovations we do now are things we were planning for the next 10 to 15 years, and now we can introduce them, or we have to introduce them at a much faster rate. Next slide, please. This is my final slide. And I think what is crucial now that we are moving from beyond crisis management. So this is what I think is a transformative moment in history. It's very encouraging, I think, to see that a lot of creativity and innovation taking place in this restructuring going on right now. Okay, so that promises well for the future. Of course, there's a lot of, I should keep emphasizing, it's not that the problems are solved, right? There's a lot of problems still out there. But I think on the one hand, it's the activity which is going on is promising. And at the same time, the issue bringing resilience to the policy discussion and putting it really on top of the policy agenda, I think is also very important, and to see this as an opportunity to create more resilient food system. And there's clearly a really important role to play both for the public sector and for the private sector in this. Thank you very much.
Johan, thank you very much. And some really interesting data there, providing a very clear outline about who is suffering most from this pandemic when it comes to food and nutrition and income, but also clearly making the argument for the critical opportunity that this moment offers. And hopefully we will get more discussion around that in the next hour. Our first session is going to offer some perspectives and some responses. And we have a real stellar lineup of contributors now who are going to give their own short responses themselves. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A session. So first up, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Karina Hawkes, and she's going to present on nutrition and sustainable diets. She is the director of the Centre for Food Policy at City University of London. She's also a distinguished fellow at the George Institute for Global Health, and she blogs at thebetterfoodjourney.com and is an absolute champion of effective food policies that work to improve outcomes such as health and environment, nutrition, and the economic aspects of food. So I'm looking forward to hearing her now. Karina.
Thank you very much, Ella, for that kind introduction. Can I just confirm you can hear me okay?
Absolutely, yeah, we can hear you great. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation today. Thank you. I'll just wait for my slides to come up onto the screen there. Thank you. Yeah, good day to everybody. Great to be here, and thank you. So I'm going to be focusing my remarks on building back better diets and nutrition in the wake of COVID-19, focused on how to reorient food systems towards better diets for all. So on this first slide, I wanted to make the point, the situation before COVID-19. And this is data that was released this past Friday, showing the situation that child and maternal malnutrition is the leading risk factor for healthy years life lost globally. This is before COVID-19. That rising levels of obesity is a majorly leading cause of increases of the health burden in the world today. And that dietary factors are the second largest cause of global deaths for women and third for men, largely due to their link with non-communicable diseases. So this is not a trivial matter. Before COVID-19, the food that we eat, malnutrition, obesity, and dietary factors are hugely contributing to global ill health. So if we're serious about building back better from COVID-19, we need to take the health and nutrition aspects of the food system very seriously indeed. And of course, then COVID came along to change the world as we know it, and it will continue to do so. So on the next slide, I wanted to highlight from a paper that I recently published about why the impacts of COVID-19 are going to be as serious as they are, and indeed being as serious as they are, because they cut across multiple systems. Let's start with the economic system. In the analysis that I present in the paper referenced here, I argue that the origins of COVID-19 started with an economic system, which placed pressure on an environmental system, which then enabled those pathogens to jump. It brought humans in closer contact with animal pathogens, enabling them to jump on to humans, the origins of COVID-19, as this next arrow shows. And then, of course, as this next arrow shows, that then impacted on the health system. If you could show the next arrow, please. Thank you. And of course, then this impacts on the health system demanded a response from the political system. And the political system then implemented policy responses in the form of lockdowns, but they differed between different countries, which then impacted further on the health system. And then, as these next arrows shows, these had profound impacts, the lockdowns, on the social system and on the economic system. And then collectively, as the next set of arrows show, these influenced the food system, with supply chains being altered, all the things that Johan Swinnen was just referring to there. And then, as this next lot of arrows shows, that then fed back and influenced the burden of the coronavirus. And from the food system perspective, some of those elements were in place before coronavirus. For example, we know that around if people who were affected by overweight and obesity have a 48% increased risk of complications from COVID-19. That is as a result of a food system which is not focused on healthy diets and nutritious foods. And then in turn, then there were these feedback effects in the system. Sorry, if you could go back to the previous slide, thank you very much. So in this system then, what we know is that these then fed back, these food system impacts then fed back and are now affecting, as a result of COVID, what we are eating. And Johan Swinnen showed some examples of that. And we know that is beginning to affect, as well as the effect through the health system and the effect through the economic system. For example, wasting is predicted to increase by 14%. So we know that diets are being affected as a result of these multiple system impacts of COVID-19. But we also know that these multiple system underlying causes of poor diets and poor nutrition were there before COVID-19. So if we fundamentally want to build back better, we need to take this approach of understanding the role of multiple systems in order that we can fundamentally transform and create better nutrition and health for all. So on the next slide, I say, okay, so one of these systems, of course, the vital system is the food system. But this system, like any other system, has multiple dimensions. The very same dimensions, the economic dimensions, the political dimensions, the health, the environment, and the social dimensions, with that food chain in the middle and the eaters and the producers in the middle. So even if we focus on the food systems, we need to engage with all of the dimensions and all of the different subsystems of that system. And if we're serious, as the next slide shows, about building back better for diet, we need to be focused on increasing the nutritious foods, but we also need to be focused on reducing the amount of unhealthy foods, for want of a better term. It's about doing both things. So what are the opportunities for building back better? Well, I've argued that the origins of COVID-19 started in the economic system. And in the impacts that we see of COVID-19, the impacts are being felt most seriously in the economic parts of the food system and indeed of people's income, the economic elements. And thank you to Johan for reinforcing that point. So let's start with the economic system, a fundamental driver, and think about how we can reconfigure that economic system in order to build back better. How do we do that? As this next point makes, I think the first thing that we need to do, and the first opportunity at this point in time, when money is being spent and invested, is that we start to refocus that economy by spending money differently in the food system. Look at this next slide here about how much money is being spent. There have been at least 621 new social protection measures after COVID-19, and Johan showed that in his slide, with a lot focused on food aid and on cash transfers. But how many of those are actually really being focused on nutritious foods? Think about the 9 trillion the IMF say are being spent on fiscal support to COVID-19. How much of that is being spent on nutritious food? And going back to before COVID, how much of the 620 billion on agricultural subsidies per year is being spent on nutritious foods? Of the massive tripling of investment that we've seen in global food and agriculture, how much of that is in nutritious food? How much of the investment funds specialized in food and agriculture, which are rising so rapidly, is focused on nutritious foods? And how much for public procurement? There are tremendous opportunities for taking the money which is already being spent, and more is being spent in the wake of COVID-19, and reorient it to reorient the entire food system towards nutritious foods. Going back to my next point though, we also need to do other things. There's a long list, and innovation will be very important here. But one of the things that we need to do, is this next point makes, is we do need to act hard in the political system to legislate, regulate and tax unhealthy food, for want of a better term, in order to enable those nutritious foods to flourish, to level the competitive playing field so that the junk foods don't distract. We know they are everywhere, even in the poorest of communities. And of course, one of the reasons we see companies pushing back of that legislation is because the economic incentives are all wrong. So that's why they're spending money differently to re-incentivize that system, the economic parts, the businesses in the food system, and to get those businesses working for nutrition is so vital. And that's going to take some hard, courageous leadership by governments. And thirdly, we need to do better, all of us working in this field, with engaging with policies and communities across these different systems. Those of us who are working on diets and nutrition, we need to do a far better job of engaging with those of people working on sustainability, working on livelihoods, working on economic development, trying to address poverty, so we can find synergies and address some of those trade-offs which are inevitable. But of course, this is a very challenging process. Governance at the global, national, and local level is not fit for purpose to act across systems. We don't have the skills either. Acting in this way takes system thinking skills. We don't have those skills in the decision-making elites. We need to train those elites in those system thinking skills so they can make better decisions. Those leaders also need to manage trade-offs. There are very many of them. They need active management. And we need courageous systems leaderships and those who are able to connect across systems in positions of leadership across the system. And as my final slide shows, we have a great opportunity with the UN Food Systems Summit for building back better food systems for better diets. There are many asks of that summit. I highlight 3 here. First of all, I'd like to see that better diets for all are positioned as a fundamental purpose of food systems in that summit. I'd like to see government and private sector commitments at that summit to spending money differently, to refocus on nutritious foods rather than the foods that either form the basis of junk food or are focused on supporting more monotonous diets. And then to consider how to improve the governance of food, and that those involved in that conversations are systems thinkers and innovators into think how we need to apply governance and policies and decision making differently in the food system. And in just my final slide, thank you very much. I would just like to highlight there that these are some of the sources of the information I presented today. Thank you very much.
Karina, thank you so much. You know, we heard Karina there for serious. We need to take health and nutrition aspects very seriously indeed. The vital system is the food system, and Karina outlining the billions and billions that are already spent on global food and agriculture, but how this money could be reoriented towards nutritious foods. There's a huge opportunity there. Karina, while I have you, if Karina is there still, you know, I'm mindful that you may need to go, and we've got a lot of speakers between now and the end. So I just wanted to ask you one brief question, Karina, in the context of the Food Summit next year and this really vital opportunity to address these urgent issues. How important do you think it is to align national food policies with these global goals and these global outcomes that we're looking for? I mean, you talk about courageous governance that's needed at the national level.
Yes, there does need to be a lot more alignment for sure. And I think one of the great challenges is, I pointed out that governance isn't fit for purpose, is that it's quite tough working in a national government when you don't have a system that is set up for working in a food systems way. And it's the same at the global level. There are fantastic people working in both government and at the global level. But the alignment and the engagement is really challenging. And we do need to have this coherence across systems at the national level and at the international level, and then between them. And the answer to me is that we need to have what I like to term system connectors, people whose job it is to work either at the national level or at the global level to connect up these different elements of systems, because otherwise it's tried to squeeze into people's day jobs and people don't have time. It's not their job to be chatting to people doing different things with different priorities. But unless we make it so, we're not going to have the alignment that we need nationally or globally.
Super. Thank you so much, Karina. I know you can stay around till 11:30, so hopefully if there are questions that come through, we'll put them to you. I'm very pleased now to welcome Dr. Sonja Vermeulen, who's going to present on climate change. And Sonja is the Director of Programs at the CGIAR System Organization, which is a global partnership that unites international organizations engaged in research about food security. And Dr. Vermeulen is also an Associate Fellow at the Hoffman Center for Sustainable Resource Economy at Chatham House. Sonja, you're very welcome, and I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Ella, and hello to everybody online. It's a huge privilege and honour to be able to participate and listen today, so thank you. Just turning now to climate change. So in June this year, at the annual meeting of the UN Global Compact, Lisa Kingo described COVID-19 as a fire drill for climate change. That's quite arresting language, and I'd like to take this opportunity in the next 10 minutes just to unpack that a little and think about how COVID-19 might be a fire drill, both in terms of how this crisis resembles climate change and therefore could be a practice, and also whether our response to COVID-19 pandemic is putting us on the right pathway to deal with climate change. So first of all, as a crisis, does the current COVID-19 pandemic resemble climate change? Well, the short answer to that is no. COVID-19 is a threat to individual lives, but climate change is an existential threat to humanity. But of course, the long answer is far more nuanced than that. While with COVID-19, we potentially have a silver bullet solution in terms of a vaccine, we know that who gets that vaccine and where and how is going to be a very complex issue of political economy with very unequal outcomes. Similarly, climate change potentially still has a set of fairly simple technical solutions in energy and in food and agriculture, but the reality is a very complex array of drivers and solutions that are dependent on a great deal of interconnected economic incentives. COVID-19 impact on food and agriculture is, as we've already heard, very much around the set of disruptions to supply chains, to labour, and also to consumers' wages and spending power. With climate change, we're going to see a much more fundamental set of disruptions to production systems, to the biophysical systems that actually underpin food production. And even more fundamentally than that, the life support systems on land and in sea that make food production possible at all. I think going forward, we're going to understand climate change as much as a human health crisis as we understand it now as an environmental crisis. I think this is something that will fundamentally change in our thinking. The burden of human disease and diseases in livestock, fisheries and crops are inevitably going to grow. We know that they will. They will become more frequent, more severe, and change in their ranges. But these will land in, more importantly, will land in very unequal public health systems and very unequal food and agriculture systems, which have very unequal capacities to respond. And that really is what we need to take forward from how we deal with COVID-19 when we're thinking about the future. So just turning to that second question, what about how we're responding to this crisis, and is it putting us on the right pathway? So first of all, let's just look at the unintentional part of our response. We all know that there's been less economic activity and less travel during this time. And indeed, we've seen the largest ever drop in the rate of emissions as a result of that. We've turned the emissions tap tighter by 11% effectively. But that hasn't stopped the greenhouse gas load in the atmosphere from growing. And the actual overall difference is that we had expected atmospheric carbon dioxide to increase by 0.68% in 2020, and instead we'll see it increasing, we expect now, by 0.6%. It's not a profound difference in the long run. Also, the predominance of the pandemic in the news is making us ignore the impacts of climate change more. Those of you who follow environmental news, it's less on the front page, but you will have seen, for example, that North America, we've had the world's first ever giga fire this year as a result of the droughts there and the huge environmental destruction that's come about as a result of that. And also not on the news have been similar massive fires across South America. Spare a thought for a country like Kenya, which earlier this year had very unusually wet conditions with the biggest locust outbreak for 70 years, and is now, as FuseNet is showing us, facing most likely a double drought in the two coming rainy seasons, which will have, again, massive impacts on food production there. More important than perhaps our current impacts on the emissions right now will be our long-term recovery pathway. And Karina's just drawn attention to the kinds of recovery packages in place. What we saw after the financial crisis, that there was enormous carbon-intensive stimulus spending that actually caused a very quick rebound in emissions. The recovery monies for COVID-19, IMF reported in May this year around 9 trillion. Other estimates go up to as much as 20 trillion will be spent. And this is a significant amount of money, and to use Yo's language earlier, has the capacity to be really transformative. So, this is an opportunity here to actually determine the trajectory of the global economy for the next decade, and hence outcomes for our climate and human well-being. So we've got an extraordinary opportunity here to invest in low carbon assets, industries and services, and also to build our resilience to that part of climate change that we're already locked into. So just for the remainder of my minutes here, I'm just going to look at how we're doing in the energy sector and in agriculture and food. So in the energy sector, because this really matters, we would need around $1 trillion a year of investment to get us on the right track in terms of renewable energies rather than fossil fuels. We have now, what we've seen is amongst the stimulus packages, about $231 billion has been allocated to fossil fuel industry and around 145 to clean energy. So we've got a bit of a glass half full and glass half empty situation here. Energy analysts actually think that investment in clean energy is putting us a good way towards the amounts that we need annually in terms of investment. So that's the positive side. Also on the positive side, we're seeing the removal of fossil fuel subsidies in some countries, for example, Nigeria. But on the negative side, actually very little of the stimulus package actually has any climate kind of conditionalities around it. We're just seeing unconditional support going to, for example, airline industries to prop them up and keep them alive with no requirements, for example, for emissions reductions. And many countries are actually lowering or dropping, not raising their regulation of fossil fuels and their associated emissions. Turning to agriculture and food, when we look across the stimulus packages, we see only about 18 to 20 billion. That's actually in the sweet spot of support to agriculture and food, but that's invested in a way that can support mitigation, climate change, mitigation and adaptation. Most of the money has been spent in Europe as well, which of course matters. Some low-income countries are really looking to stimulus packages that do not necessarily carry strong climate credentials, lots of subsidies for fertilizer and machinery to keep agriculture alive. Also, as we've heard from Yo, a lot of the money is going to mend supply chain fractures. On the positive side, there has been investment in public procurement, building and deploying public inventories of food, and also in insurance that can really help build resilience. Interestingly, there has been some back migration from urban to rural areas, and some countries such as Myanmar, Zambia, Uzbekistan actually put in place quite interesting, almost back to the land kinds of policies to support local self-sufficiency, food for work, that type of thing. So that brings me to a conclusion of these brief remarks. So the fire drill, how is it going? Well, I would say it's a little bit of a reluctant fire drill. We're moving outside, but popping back in to collect our personal belongings and not quite willing to take full action. But I think on the positive side, we have proved to ourselves, first of all, that with the right public policy incentives, large-scale behavioural change is possible. And we can also see more clearly than ever that human health, planetary health, and social equality are tightly connected, and that the solutions too will be inextricable. Thank you.
Sonia, thank you so much for that. You speak about the recovery money for COVID pandemic being a transformative opportunity, and just briefly wanted to ask you, what do you think are the mechanisms for implementing this conditionality you talk about? So is it at a national level or higher? I'm thinking, for example, Ireland, so I'm thinking of the CAP negotiations at the moment, which are being negotiated at EU level. It would seem a huge opportunity there. But where do you see that conditionality and the mechanisms?
Yeah, well, I mean, it obviously differs depending on the country. So I think globally, the biggest opportunity is going to be at the national level. On the promising side, we've heard a huge pledge by China around reaching carbon neutrality by 2060 and getting very serious about exploring how that will happen. So I think predominantly the national level. Europe clearly does have a common agricultural policy, which gives us a different kind of scope for play here. In Ireland, I think you can single yourselves out. I did look up the stats and saw that in the 7.4 billion recovery package, only 273 million of it could be considered green. So there probably is a bit of space for self-examination there. Mm-hmm. The European apparatus will probably be moving more slowly, though, however, than what you're able to do at national level. Thanks.
Thank you, Sonia. And, again, to the people who are watching, please submit your questions and we will make sure to put them to the panelists at the end of this session. Thank you very much, Sonia. I'm going to introduce now Melissa Leach, who is going to provide perspectives on justice and equality. Melissa is the director of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. She's a social anthropologist and geographer and a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. She's also a fellow of the British Academy, and in 2017 was awarded a CBE for services to social science. You're very welcome, Melissa. I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much. And if I could have my slides, please. I'd like to start by saying what a privilege it is to be part of this conversation, and I hope very much that my remarks will complement and follow on from the extremely good, I think, and to the point talks that we've had so far. So I want to look at some perspectives on equality and justice, but also on politics as a crucial part of the debate that we now need to have. And I'm just going to start by showing, in a sense, some of the origins and the kind of work that I'm speaking from. So one is the current strategy that we launched earlier this year, that we created before COVID, but launched as COVID had started in June, and realized that actually this was a strategy that still had a lot of legs, because what we're trying to do at IDS, working with partners, is to bring knowledge and action that can help respond to the disruptions of our era. So we've got several major commitments that we see as all connected. And as part of this work, we're taking forward with partners a strategic research initiative on food equity. So I can have the next slide. I'm also drawing here on a longer trajectory of research on food system transformations and also the equity issues and politics that emerge there. So as other speakers have emphasized, even before COVID-19 hit, the challenge to transform our food systems into a state which colleagues and I from Future Earth identified as equitable sustainability was very much there. And this is transformation. We're dealing with food systems that were already deeply unsustainable and inequitable. The Sustainable Development Goals set, understood as a sort of package, set some intermediate targets for where we need to move to try and keep our food systems and the wider social and ecological and indeed economic systems within which they are embedded within this space that we identified as equitable sustainability. And as colleagues and I recently argued in a piece that's just come out, a review article in World Development, that requires a focus on politics at multiple scales and of multiple sorts that I will come to in a minute. So if I could have the next slide. I've also been arguing again with colleagues that equity and justice needs to be thought of in a multidimensional way. So we've already in this conference heard a lot about equity, equity in diets, and also the economic forms of equity and inequity within which they're embedded. But in 2016, we argued in the World Social Science Report for a multidimensional equity framework where whether one is talking about equity of outcomes, so equal access and achievement of nutritious food and diets in terms of this conversation, or equity in the underlying processes and systems that lead to those outcomes, we need to think not just about the economic, but also about other kinds of equity, the social, the cultural, relating to questions often of ethnicity and race, political opportunities for voice and power, spatial inequities and equities, relating, for instance, to urban-rural dynamics, environmental equities, and those that are grounded in knowledge and whose knowledge counts. And then the outside of this little ring suggests that in processes of decision-making, equity really counts. We need to think about who is recognized, about equity in the procedures of decision-making, and then what are the distributional effects. So if I could have the next slide. At IDS and with colleagues, we've been responding to COVID-19 in a number of different ways. Some of that work is directly responsive, running knowledge platforms which try and bring evidence to support the public health and the social and economic response, help desks and platforms. But crucially also work on building back better, where the argument has been that there are now crucial opportunities to transform development and indeed transform food systems as part of that. And this positioning paper that we produced for Irish Aid very much engages with Ireland's new policy towards a better world, which talks about putting the furthest behind first, really taking further forward that Sustainable Development Goals argument for leaving no one behind. And so if I could have the next slide, the final piece of background work here, my affiliation to IPES Food was mentioned, and the communique that we launched actually early in the COVID-19 crisis made a similar argument that there are now key opportunities for transforming food systems and their political economies. So if I could have the next slide, here broadly is the argument that I want to lay out. COVID-19 has laid bare and amplified multiple kinds of inequity in food systems that we were already seeing. So we know that hunger and food insecurity were already serious. COVID has amplified them in a number of different ways, referring to different kinds of inequity. So we've got our differential vulnerabilities to disease, which in turn affect people's abilities to produce and consume and access food. We've got care work for COVID, often falling to women, but also with class and ethnic dimensions, which affect food access and preparation, as well as having direct impacts on health. We have, of course, the broader impacts of public health measures on isolation, on movement restrictions affecting access to food, and falling especially hard on poorer people, and indeed amplifying spatial inequalities, and particularly the impacts we've seen on people in low-income settlements, suffering particularly from lockdowns. We've got the impacts of market closures, which, as we've seen, yes, do cut off vital provisioning routes and sales outlets, but have impacts not just on the poor, but also by gender, because many of those traders are women. If I could have the next slide. We've seen the overall disruption to food supply chains, but I think those have not just been less, but also much more diverse, as Johan has shown, than many predicted at the outset. But also the wider economic crisis has been felt deeply unequally by poverty, by gender, and by where people are. So I won't rehearse some of the data. These are just some further aspects of data. We've seen a lot here from IFPRI. But I did want to underline that the impacts often fall hardest on people already facing discrimination and marginalization of social and political kinds, as well as economic kinds, whether we're talking about women workers or whether we're talking about people who are already migrant laborers forced to stay still, or displaced people. So if I could have the next slide. I think the other side, though, is that COVID-19 has shown and revealed a whole set of positive responses, which have actually helped to maintain and even enhance what one could call equitable food security. And some of them, yes, are government responses. We've already heard about those. But I think we also have to attend to those that have emerged from communities and indeed from civil society in many parts of the world, whether we're talking about neighborhood networks and community provisioning groups, food deliveries, formal and informal, traders' alliances, which have often bubbled up from below to keep markets open in safe ways, localized farming and gardening in urban and rural settings, many of them following that broad set of agroecological and food sovereignty principles, often highly localized, and many people turning to these shorter supply chains. And I agree that there's a debate about supply chains, but sometimes in this crisis, direct sourcing has been revealed as often more resilient. And in many examples, government responses have been most effective when they've worked hand in hand with civil society, whether we're talking about the government support in Kerala to the community kitchens that women's networks have run, or turn to France, where government has worked very effectively with farmers' unions in a whole integrated package, supporting community agriculture schemes and accelerating pre-existing plans to relocalize food production. So turning to my next slide, the question that I think we need to ask now is, do these seeds, do these kind of opportunities that we're seeing emerging from below as well as from above offer seeds of transformation, perhaps, towards the more resilient, equitable food systems that we already needed before COVID hit and now have been shown to need more than ever? Is it the case that this crisis offers an opening of what I think one can describe as the lock-in or stranglehold of our industrialized food systems, which we already know are unsustainable and inequitable and supported by politics and power in many ways? Do they provide now an opportunity to open up and take the kind of approach that many civil society, grassroots groups, social movements have been already advocating for some time? And in particular, I draw attention to those opportunities that lie in agroecology and food sovereignty. Or will the status quo actually resume once the crisis recedes? and possibly even will the more authoritarian states and agribusinesses actually seek to manipulate this crisis for profit. This was in fact what happened after the global financial crisis in 2008 and the food crisis that followed that, where many people saw an opening and an opportunity for transformation. And actually we saw quite rapidly a reclosure to some of the same political economic relations that had been operating before. Very much the argument that Naomi Klein makes in the shock doctrine. And I think the jury is out. I think we could see a positive or a negative, and this is going to depend on politics and power. So in that World Development article I briefly referred to, we put forward the idea that we're now thinking about pathways and transformational pathways, which can take us in different directions. We need to ask what directions they're headed in. Are they going to keep us and move us back into that equitable sustainability space or take us right outside? How is politics and power going to shape these? Do we have a sufficient diversity of pathways? COVID is showing us that one size doesn't fit all, and we're going to need diverse pathways to respond to diverse situations in different countries, in different localities. What are the implications for distribution? Who's going to gain and lose from current or proposed pathways? And what are the implications for democracy? Those points about equity that happen around that circle that I showed. Equity of opportunity for voice, for inclusion, for recognition, and for a stake in the procedures and decision-making that is taking us forward. So to conclude, if I could have my final slide, I think the opportunities and priorities that are now there, if we're going to use the COVID moment to build resilient and equitable systems that really work for those furthest behind, I think we need to take the opportunity to foster a long needed paradigm shift, which takes us away from industrial agriculture and food systems to far more diversified agroecologically based systems. We need to target not just the short term, but some of these deeper structural and political economic issues and processes that already limit people's agency in accessing diverse and nutritious food and diets. That's going to mean strengthening not just national systems, but also local innovation systems and the informal ones as well as the formal. And it's going to mean some reforms to food systems governance, nationally around new pacts between state and citizens towards food equity, dietary equity and sustainability, but also some revitalizing of those global governance reforms that were initiated in the wake of the 2008 food price crisis, really now putting in place those tools to accelerate the food system transformations that we now need. The UN has a key role to play. The Committee on Food Security, I think, is a key forum. And there are also vital opportunities, again, at next year's UN Food Systems Summit to focus or perhaps refocus its aims and its proposed outcomes and proposals on these vital tasks about resilience, equity, and agroecology in helping us to deliver. So if I could have my final slide, this is just to say thank you for listening and looking forward to discussing.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And you talk about, just briefly, you talk about whose voice counts, and we heard earlier from Johan Swinnen about the differing impacts of COVID on women and children in particular.
Yeah.
You mentioned Kerala and the Women's Network running free community kitchens and the really important effective ways to ensure food distribution to those who need it the most. And I just wonder very briefly, globally, do you see the successful implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals as the best way of achieving this kind of rebalance, or are there other more effective ways?
Well, I think there's a real complementarity between what has been realized about the Sustainable Development Goals, that they're not 17 goals and 169 targets which can be acted on and implemented in silos. They're actually a package which helps to set directions for some quite fundamental transformations in interconnected systems, very much in the way that Karina and indeed Johan have outlined. So thought of in that way, there's a direct connection between revitalizing our move towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which do talk about not just food in goal 2, but actually inequality, gender equity, climate change, partnerships, governance, security. These genuinely are a package, which requires some fundamental shifts in ways of doing things, and taking advantage of the openings and the glimpses and seeds of transformation that we're seeing through the COVID response, really to revitalize the energy that the world is putting behind these goals, locally, nationally, and globally.
Thank you so much. And there are more questions now coming in from our viewers, which we will put to you in about 5 or 6 minutes. I'm going to introduce now Mike Taylor, who's going to speak about land rights and tenure. Mike is the director of the International Land Coalition, which is a global alliance of over 200 intergovernmental and civil society organizations. He grew up in a small village in Botswana, and it instilled in him a conviction that land rights are fundamental to building a more just and inclusive world. He was recently named as a member of the Champions Network for next year's Food Systems Summit. Mike, you're very welcome, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ella. If I could have my first slide, please. And just to say what an honor it is to follow such excellent speakers on really a complex and a challenging topic as this. I'm going to zoom in on one aspect of it, which is tenure rights, predictable, because I work for the International Land Coalition. But we believe very strongly that at the basis of looking at things like food systems, and food systems are not the only systems we look at, but in this conversation, food systems, that rights to own, to access, to use land, water, natural resources is really very fundamental to what kind of systems, food systems we want to be building. So next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about the why and the how. So just starting with the why, next slide, why we think tenure rights are so important, and what are tenure rights trying to achieve in a discussion of this nature, is really coming back to echoing what several of the speakers so far have emphasized very rightly indeed, that we very much need a systemic approach, because food systems are built and happen within the wider systems, going back to Karina's presentation. From the International Land Coalition, and I'm going to share with you perspectives, basically I'm building on perspectives from our 250 members. Small-scale producers would be put very much at the center of more resilient and sustainable food systems. And I think the first point here on resilience, and I'm echoing a word which I'm glad has been mentioned a lot already, is that we can't look at resilience in food systems without looking at resilience in the other systems that we're dealing with, and very much trying to build a more resilient food system for our membership is trying to also address a number of other immediate crises, most directly the climate crisis, the crisis in democracy, and the crisis in inequality. So I'm going to refer a little bit to those in talking about how tenure is a pathway towards building resilience in these different areas. If I can have the next slide, please. I think the first point to make is that looking at access to land and food systems, we're on a very, very uneven playing field. So we have quite naturally a diversity in land holding and in access to land and resources. But we see, as we do in other aspects of inequality, economic inequality, wealth inequality, income inequality, an increasing polarization. So I'll just give you a couple of figures from a report that we'll be launching next month with the participation of the European Commission on land and inequality. One of the figures that we'll put out in that report is if you take the 2-hectare dividing line, roughly 80% of farms are smaller than that and 12% are larger. Next slide. If you go to the more extremes, the largest 1% of farms in the world operate more than 70% of the world's farmland. So from an access to land and natural resources perspective, we have great concentration of power of a small number of players. And there's good data. It's not from us. It's from others that look further along in the value chain of the concentration of corporate power in the whole value system. But it's just to say that starts from the beginning in the control of land and natural resources. Go to the next slide, please. So if one of the things we're doing for this report is trying to get a better grip of inequality in access to land and natural resources and the trends. So here's data using the Gini coefficient of land, which we've been developing with the World Inequality Lab, led by Thomas Piketty. And you can see that while it's different from region to region, across the world as a whole, and even in Africa where it's been falling since the mid-70s, we now have an increasing inequality in access to land. If you look at the next slide, when you start taking a more nuanced approach with the Gini coefficient, and you look not just at the Gini data, which is the blue bars, but you look at the data on the size of land holdings. But if you look at the value of land holdings, then you realize that the distribution is even more skewed. And then when you include landless people, so people who live off the land and work on the land, but don't actually have tenure to that land, then we end up with an even greater overall picture of inequality in access to land, and that's right across the regions. So I'm going to move on to the what. If we go to the next slide, yeah. And just with this background, that as we think about what we need to do to be building more resilient food systems, we're working in a context of extreme inequalities in access to land, and therefore extreme inequalities in access to decision making and the sort of democratic processes around what should happen to that land. So starting with 4 points on what do we need to do to overcome the immediate vulnerabilities that we see in the COVID crisis. And I'll ask the organizers to put into the chat a link to a document where you can see examples from each of these from our different countries where our members are dealing with these issues. But in terms of the immediate context of COVID-19, firstly, we see increased land-based conflict where urban dwellers are going back to rural areas and land rights are not clear, and conflict either aimed at the incomers or from incomers who may be slightly more wealthy, aimed at local people over the same piece of land is flaring out. So there's an urgent need for mechanisms to mitigate that conflict. We're seeing really an increase in land grabs, and one could even say policy grabs, quick changes in policy that governments are putting in place, often in the name of accelerating economic opportunity, that may not be very friendly towards poorer landowners. So protection from this kind of opportunistic grabbing of land that we're seeing in many countries. Clearly, there's a need for greater protection of indigenous peoples' territories, and I'm sure you'll be aware of the terrible stories in many parts of the world, particularly Latin America, where COVID-19 is going into indigenous peoples' territories that often have poor health infrastructure, and the decimation that's coming out because of that. And then lastly, again, if women's land rights are not adequately protected, then as a spouse dies with increased death rates related to COVID, often the women are dispossessed. So that's 4 areas where we see urgent need, and our members are working with their governments to try and get these immediate protections in place. But moving to 4 areas that we would emphasize in building long-term resilience in protecting the food systems, in land rights that protect food systems, particularly of smallholder producers. The first would be granting tenure rights or recognizing tenure rights as a basis for systemic support to the role of small-scale producers. So as I said at the beginning, our model, and I won't go into the arguments for that because Melissa in particular has done that very well, is that we need to be building future food systems which give a fair and a central place to the small scale producers that produce most of the world's food. Now, obviously, tenure rights is the beginning. It's no use recognizing, protecting tenure rights for the small scale producers if they don't have a place in markets, if inputs and support are not arriving. So I'm not trying to say that tenure rights is all that are needed, but certainly we would emphasize that as a starting point, that protects small farmers from losing their land and enables a more inclusive food systems. Secondly, next slide, please. Tenure rights are a basis for providing systemic support to the role of small-scale producers through more localized value chains. Again, it's something that my predecessors have already mentioned. I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. Secondly, on strengthening women's rights to land. It goes without saying, but women, particularly small-scale producers, are often the primary household providers of household nutrition, and equally often women's rights are the least recognized. The third point: redistribute and secure tenure rights for the poorest to overcome exclusion and marginalization. This is situating tenure rights within the wider processes of exclusion and marginalization from decision making. So having more recognizing the role that these populations play in food systems and granting them the right to do so is a step towards wider inclusion, wider equality. And then lastly, and this relates back to what Sonia was saying about climate change, enabling the participation of communities in the management of territories and local ecosystems. And here I think it's important to emphasize that when we talk about food systems, we're not just talking about small farmers. We're talking about all kinds of food which might be cultivated, which might be on the hoof, which might be gathered from forests, and that those kind of food production systems also play a very strong role in the stewardship of natural resources and in keeping carbon in the ground. So I know that sort of raced through very quickly some key, what we would see as need for action areas on tenure governance that have a role in protecting and strengthening the food systems of small-scale producers. But I'd like in my last slide just to focus on one particular opportunity that several of the speakers have already mentioned, and I'm glad that Martin from the Secretariat is following, because like has already been said, the Food Systems Summit, and I liked Melissa's word, she said, is it going to be reaffirming the status quo or sowing seeds of transformation? And this is very much the perspective within our network, within ILC. as I was introduced by Ella, I'm one of the champions of the Food System Summit, and I take that role with the mandate of ILC to, as far as possible, promote the possibility for this summit to be a platform to hear from the voices of small-scale producers who feed most of the world. And I think there's a distinct risk that it won't be. There's a distinct risk that if you start a process like this and you have it absolutely open, as the Special Envoy has often said in meetings about the Food Systems Summit, as a platform where every voice can be heard, that naturally there are some voices which are much louder and much more organized and much more powerful than others. And so I think a key question for us is this very significant opportunity. How do we mitigate those risks? How do we build a process towards the Food Systems Summit and the summit itself, which is really an opportunity to think about transformation and to hear from those people that should be at the center of these different models that offer us hope for the future, to be heard and to be part of, for a change, guiding a new vision towards food systems. I'll end there. I know that I've covered a lot in a short time, but I'd be happy to dig in a bit deeper in any of the issues in the discussion. Thank you very much, Ella.
Mike, thank you so much. And, you know, the largest 1% of farms in the world operate more than 70% of the world's farmland. Is just an extraordinary fact. We are running into slight time difficulties now. So although I have quite a few questions I'd love to put to you, I'm going to move on to our final speaker before we hear then from Minister Coveney. We've obviously heard a wide range of perspectives, from climate change and nutrition to land rights and equality, and we're delighted now to welcome our final speaker in this session, Dr. Martin Frick. He is the Deputy to the Special Envoy for the UN Food Systems Summit that we've heard so much about, and tasked to provide leadership guidance and strategic direction towards this critical summit next year. Martin is going to talk now for about 8 to 10 minutes about how the work of the Food Systems Summit can tie in with what we have heard presented and how it will seek to tackle some of the challenges that we have heard so clearly highlighted. Martin, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Ella, and I shall be brief. I'm on a slightly unstable internet connection. If I start to break up, just tell me and I switch out my camera. I want to go, I have prepared a little presentation about the summit, but I don't think that I need to do that. I want to go straight into what I have heard and the key issues here. I think, if I start with what Karina has said, we need system thinking, and we are not equipped to system thinking. We are trying to build a food system summit that really looks into the relatedness. I'm in the Secretariat now for a bit more than 4 years, and I can honestly say it's incredibly difficult to do that, particularly because of the systems perspective of that. And I agree with what Michael just said, that if you're open to anyone, there is a risk that some voices are better organized and louder than others. And with the food systems, we are, of course, right at the heart of the two biggest issues that we have to deal with in the UN. One is the question of equity, and inequity ultimately is the biggest obstacle to lasting peace, and peace is why the UN was founded. And on the other side, the reality that we are outside our planetary boundaries, and we need a food system that helps us not only staying within these boundaries, but actually coming back, restoring what we have lost, undoing the damage of the past. And it's very much like in the encyclical letter Laudato Si that the Pope has issued 5 years ago, where he said the environmental and the social crisis are really two sides of the same coin. And this is why this summit is an SDG summit. It's a summit organized by the Secretary General out of New York in the logic of the last 10 years of the SDG. Now, this has led to a bit of misunderstanding, this and COVID, but I'm coming to that. One thing is that The summit is not organized by the Committee for Food Security, which was the organizer of the last summit. But this is because it is an SDG summit and it's convened by the Secretary General. Is the Committee for Food Security the central provider of expertise and of knowledge and of inclusiveness? Yes, of course it is. And we are working on every possibility together with the Committee on Food Security. Now, I want to share a bit of my personal catch-22 here. And again, it relates very much to what Melissa said, what Michael said, but also what Sonia said, because, you know, I have been working on climate change since 12 years now, always under the lens of climate justice. And if you look at what climate justice means, it's quite simply that those people who contributed least to climate change are suffering most. But if you think it further, how do you create climate justice? Well, first and foremost, by working for smallholder farmers and for landless people, because they are the people who are most hit, and they are also the possible agents of change. Now, the problem is that, of course, if you want to work on a food system summit and you want to include everybody, some are better organized than others, some are easier to get than others. And in particular, if we want to reach out to social movements, to civil society, particularly from the global south, then we need support. And we have asked the civil society mechanism of the Committee on Food Security to help us. But there's a perception that it's not worthwhile engaging because this summit would be in the hands of big business and we would be doing our content work without including civil society. Now, let me say one thing. The key of our work is 5 action tracks in which we will be looking into access to safe and nutritious food. And that is very much about equity. The second one is about shift to sustainable consumption patterns, which is so pertinent for COVID. You know, Dr. Tedros has just said the biggest response to COVID is actually to provide nutritious food to the people in need. And I entirely agree. The third one is on planetary boundaries. We call it shift to nature positive production, where we will be looking into stop conversion, B, sustainably managed land. And that is, of course, where agroecology comes in. Most certainly it does. And the third one is about restoration, that we need to bring back this over 50% of the world's land that is likely to severely degraded. The fourth one is on livelihoods. And I think that was another point that Michael made, that food systems are not only about smallholders. This session is about COVID. The hotspots of COVID is exactly people working for cheap meat in slaughterhouses, migrant workers under unspeakable conditions. And it's not a coincidence that we see outbreak of COVID there. And the fifth one is overarching, which is building resilience. Now, I said I want to address a misunderstanding. Now, the misunderstanding is simply this. None of these action tracks have met so far. We are building them, we are asking, we are inviting civil society participation. Now, I know it sounds a bit odd because it's a year since the Secretary General has announced the summit, but it took time to build these action tracks. And I know from all of the chairs of their action tracks that they are not only open to civil society participation, but they're actively looking for them. And only last week, unfortunately, the timing was such that, quite irritating presentation in the Committee for Food Security has a little bit disturbed the tone. But quite last week, the 5 chairs and the 10 co-chairs coming from all over the world have written to the Committee for Food Security, to the civil society mechanism, asking for collaboration. So I hope we are coming out of this catch-22 when we, at the one side, stand there like the lover with a bouquet of flowers and say, please, please, please help us. Working on the inclusiveness and making it a people summit as we want. And on the other side, having the people we want to work with saying, we are not working with you because you're not including the people from the ground. I think we have to overcome that. and really provide the People's Summit that we are announcing. And I can tell you, the special envoy, you just look at her personal story, but also the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, who is chairing our advisory board, is absolutely adamant of this being a People's Summit, scrutinizing every nomination, every bit of our leadership structure to ensure that this is a 21st century summit that has the South in a very strong role, that has gender as a cross-cutting topic, that has the rights of indigenous people at the very heart of the summit. And that includes, for example, the special rapporteur on the right of food, to ensure that we are constantly aware that we are not dealing with charity or anything, we are dealing with right holders. And I myself, I'm one of the people who built the Human Rights Council in 2007. I certainly am aware that this is a human rights issue more than anything else. So if I can use this platform for one thing, then it's just saying, please do get involved. It would be a tragedy if civil society would miss the opportunity to have really the most inclusive summit I have seen in 25 years as a diplomat. Over to you, Ella. Thank you.
Dr. Martin Frick, thank you so much. And we have a number of questions that have come in for you and also the panelists. So I'm just asking the panelists if you are able, and I know that Karina had to leave, if you're able to stay on for the next 10 or 15 minutes, we'd be very grateful and we'll put some questions to you. I'm very keen now to move on though to session 2, looking at the future of EU-Africa partnership. And I'm particularly keen to bring in now the Ireland's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney. We are very grateful to you, Minister Coveney, for your time this morning. We're delighted to have you. I'm mindful of your time, so I'm going to hand it over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ella. Good to see you. And I know you're very both passionate and supportive of a lot of the issues that are being discussed this morning. So thanks for your involvement as well. And it's great to see Martin Frick and others giving us their time this morning. I'm conscious that some of the previous speakers have been speaking directly to the camera, and I have a text here that I'm going to read, which I'm never that comfortable with, but hopefully it's interesting enough to provoke some thinking and some questions for the panel session afterwards. So can I just first of all thank the speakers for their contribution during the previous session. We've heard about the impact of COVID-19 on global food systems, and it is clear that there is a major global hunger challenge to be met right now. The COVID-19 pandemic threatens to roll back decades of progress in some areas. No region of the world is immune. That so many millions are hungry across parts of Africa is a reason for specific concern. And today's deliberations will help, I hope, to renew the impetus for strengthening EU-African partnerships to tackle these challenges together. So far, Ireland has allocated about 130 million euros to the global response to COVID-19. Last week's budget contained an allocation of 868 million euros to Ireland's overseas aid budget for next year. That's an increase of about 30 million euros on last year. And this, I hope, is a demonstration of the government's commitment to a better world, even during a period of significant contraction and uncertainty, and a recognition that we must invest in the welfare of others if we are to secure our investment in ourselves at home. Today's discussion takes place at an important time for the EU-African partnership. From the beginning of her mandate, the new European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, has prioritised the EU's partnership with Africa, and she's right to do that and has strong support from an Irish perspective. And that has been symbolised by her very first visit as President to Addis Ababa. Unfortunately, the next EU-African Union Summit has been postponed to next spring due to the pandemic and for obvious reasons. But the summit will be an opportunity to renew and deepen EU-Africa partnership, making it fit for purpose for the new opportunities and challenges that our two continents face. And I think most people would accept that the current political relationships and structures to facilitate those relationships are simply not fit for purpose. Ireland strongly supports a more ambitious EU relationship with Africa. This is clearly stated in the government's Africa strategy. It is evident that the future prosperity and security of both Europe and Africa are deeply intertwined. The impacts of the COVID crisis have demonstrated the continued need for the EU's prioritization of its relationships with Africa as a whole. And looking ahead, as the world's youngest continent, global economic growth in the second half of this century will very much center around African growth. Working together as Team Europe, the EU and its member states swiftly channeled almost €6 billion to support the response to COVID in sub-Saharan Africa. Team Europe is also leading on efforts to deliver a vaccine that can reach everybody in the world, including in the poorest parts of the world. In fact, yesterday in government, we had a discussion in relation to collective EU efforts to essentially advance purchase vaccines with companies before they're actually approved and become available. And I think that needs to be happening at a global level to ensure that countries that simply will not be able to financially afford to compete with wealthy countries will also have the access to vaccines that they need, particularly countries that have weak health systems that desperately need that access. COVID-19 has delayed the process of the EU and Africa planning to make this year a priority year. However, the deep shock of the pandemic allows us to look afresh now at the EU-Africa partnership and to consider with our African partners and friends what we can better do together. Today's discussion can help us input into the objectives for the EU-African Union Summit, specifically as we consider the impact of COVID-19 and collective action towards achieving sustainable food systems. I see great potential for future collaboration on food systems transformation with African partners. The EU's new Green Deal and ongoing work on farm to fork and biodiversity strategies provide specific opportunities there. Another great opportunity is the African Continental Free Trade Area, the world's most ambitious economic integration initiative right now. It will boost intra-Africa trade and in doing so could be transformational in supporting regional agricultural value chains and in contributing to food security. The EU is a long-standing supporter of economic integration in Africa. Our own experience of economic integration in the European Union gives us an important role to play in supporting the ambition of this new free trade area, which is still very much in development. I strongly believe that there is much more that the EU and Africa can do together to make the world a better place. Working together, there are opportunities for us to be champions of multilateralism, finding global solutions to global problems that impact perhaps on us differently, but certainly in a connected way. This has never been more important. The pandemic threatens the already vulnerable multilateral rules-based order and risks reversing the progress we have made in achieving many of the Sustainable Development Goals from a progress perspective. As you know, combating global hunger and malnutrition and building the resilience of rural communities are central to Ireland's development aid policy called A Better World. We have also committed to reaching those who have been left furthest behind first. A Better World recognises the important role Irish state agencies and the private sector can play in maximising the impact of Ireland's development cooperation by supporting valuable institutional exchanges and promoting new partnerships. Last year, the government supported a high-level food systems policy coaching event in Kigali. Hosted by the government of Rwanda, FAO, and the African Union Commission, it brought together policymakers and agri-food industry representatives from Ireland, Angola, Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. The event was an opportunity to share experiences and how to approach policymaking that fosters innovation as well as sustainability. It was also a great opportunity for Ireland to share our own experience in transforming the agri-food sector in an inclusive and sustainable manner. I'm also pleased to see that the COVID-19 pandemic has not hindered the ambition of applicants to the Africa Agri-Food Development Programme, the AADP this year in 2020. This is a program that I'm particularly attached to because I set it up when I was the Minister for Agriculture, working with the Department of Foreign Affairs then, many years ago. This is a grant financing program supporting collaboration between the Irish agri-food sector and African companies and African partners. Between 2013 and 2019, the AADP has provided grant funding of nearly €3.5 million and leveraged over €7.5 million in private sector investment into the African agri-food sector. At present, AADP is supporting partnerships in sectors ranging from coffee to animal health, from therapeutic food production to dairy production, potato and mango food chains also. As global opinion converges on the need for transformed food systems, the Department of Foreign Affairs, in close cooperation with our Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, is working towards adopting a sustainable food systems approach. This will help us to integrate themes such as agriculture and rural development, nutrition, gender equality, climate action, and private sector engagement. Taking this approach will drive higher impact of Ireland's development activities, especially for the furthest behind. The seminal initiative that has influenced our thinking to date is the European Commission's Task Force for Rural Africa, or the TFRA, ably chaired by our very own Tom Arnold. The TFRA's report has placed emphasis on the central role of the agri-food sector and the rural economy in the EU-Africa partnership for the future. In response to the TFRA, the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine convened a multi-stakeholder national team here in Ireland. The team was tasked to develop a framework within which we could enhance and improve the coordination and contribution of Ireland to the transformation of Africa's agriculture and rural economy. Chaired again by Tom Arnold, the task team was comprised of representatives from the private sector, from civil society, state bodies, the African community in Ireland, and of course academia. I received the final draft earlier this week, and I'm delighted to see this process come to fruition. The report strategically connects with the two main themes that are highlighted today. Firstly, the growing strategic importance of Africa for Europe and indeed Ireland. And secondly, the growing international recognition of the importance of sustainable food systems and in reducing hunger, improving nutrition and health generally, and of course, tackling climate change and the biodiversity challenges that we all face together. Tom will elaborate more on the report's findings in a moment. I'd like to acknowledge and thank him for his leadership and the members of the task force for the considerable work that went into this report. As usual, we're getting extraordinary leadership from Tom Arnold whenever we ask him to help us on a challenge like this. I look forward to working with officials from both departments in response to the ambitious set of recommendations that have been given to us. Our ongoing work on food systems internationally and domestically will strengthen our position in preparing for the 2021 UN Food Systems Summit, which was referred to earlier. This will be a landmark occasion, bringing all stakeholders together to recommit attention to developing well-functioning, sustainable food systems. It will remind the global community that food systems are vital to the achievement of the SDGs and building back better after COVID-19. It is critical that Ireland play its part throughout the process to ensure that the outcomes are both ambitious and also achievable. We owe it to farming families, businesses, and consumers on the African continent, and indeed across the European Union as well, to do so. So Ella, thanks very much. I hope that wasn't too structured a presentation, given the conversation. It's always more difficult to be engaging on a video screen than it is in person, particularly when people are reading long speeches. But hopefully it will trigger some questions for the discussion now that you're going to have with your panelists. And thanks very much for the opportunity to make a brief presentation.
We are very grateful to you for your time, and I know there has been concern as countries struggle with the economic impact of COVID. and also Brexit for Ireland, that they'll retreat from tackling these global issues. And I think it's very important and heartening to hear you restate your own determination that Ireland will not do this. You know, and it's a very important thing in terms of the role that Ireland can play in its own way on the global stage. So thank you very much for that and for your time, and stay safe.
Thanks a million. And just to reassure everybody in this call, I mean, we have made a commitment that by 2030, Ireland would be contributing 0.7% of effectively our national wealth to our development cooperation partnerships around the world. And we're going to meet that target. And even in really, really difficult years like this one, we insisted on increasing our development aid funding quite significantly by an extra 30 million euros. So hopefully that is some reassurance to people that when times get better economically here, and they will, we'll be able to do much, much more than that. And you know, the example of that was 2 years ago when we increased our funding by 120 million euros in 1 year. And that's the kind of space we will get back into, hopefully every year, when we have normal levels of economic activity and growth, so that we can shift some of that wealth generation to increasing opportunities and supporting vulnerable people, and building the kind of partnerships that today's discussion is all about. And if there's one area where I think Ireland has real credibility, along with some of the traditional areas like education and gender, is sustainable food systems, and linking the challenges of development, climate, biodiversity, and the production of food and food supply chains. I think it's an area where Ireland really wants to be a world leader, and to build relationships and partnerships with other parts of the world that can allow us to share our mistakes and successes, because we've had both over the last century or so in this space, but to do that in a way that can impact on as many people as possible. So once again, to everybody on this line, good luck with the work that you're doing, and we'll certainly be a sustained and strong partner into the future.
This is very important. Thank you so much, Minister Coveney, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce Tom Arnold. But before I do that, in terms of the next session, I want to very briefly ask a question of Dr. Martin Frick, who is, of course, the Deputy to the Special Envoy for the UN Food Systems Summit next year, which is proving to be such an important moment, will be such an important moment to address so many of the questions and the issues that need to be tackled. And Martin, I suppose, you know, one of the key questions is there time enough for action? And also, is there enough will out there to make sure that all these critical issues can be solved?
Well, I start with the will. It's actually astonishing how much will is there, and you know, constantly in conversations with all sorts of different stakeholders. And I think what COVID has done also is really shifting some mindsets. Sometimes also when you speak to industry, you're astonished what you hear in terms of taking responsibility for externalities caused in order to empower smallholder farmers, shorten value chains, look at restorative agriculture approaches. I think there is not only a will to action, but there's a will to dialogue, which I think we should certainly take. Is there enough time? Well, you know, I'm coming out of the climate change world where we have been saying for the last 12 years, we are running out of time, and we are running out of time faster and faster and faster. I don't think that, you know, 1 year is enough to change the entire world's food systems, but it is maybe time enough to define pathways. And, you know, the Food Systems Summit is not only one moment in time, it is actually a year-long engagement process, including country level and independently organized dialogues in every single country, and in independent organized dialogues also in cities or regions or biospheres or whatever you have, and really to define those and to ask the question, what do we need to do in order to get us to a more inclusive, nutritious, inclusive and sustainable food system? And I hope we can really trigger these discussions. One of the 4 outcomes that we are sharing with everybody, number 4 of that, is indeed not to stop and drop the pen by next year come the summit moment, because what the world does not need is grand announcements that are not being followed through. So we are working in a perspective of an inclusive engagement process over the year following, coming to the summit, but also following up and making sure that these commitments are respected, and hopefully create communities and a large community of action globally to drive this change.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think it's very important also just to reiterate your own mention earlier of the role of civil society in the Food Summit as well, that it's not just going to be a top-down thing, but also people can become involved and get their voices heard. And of course, that's
absolutely
important, if nothing else from a democratic point of view. So thank you for that. I'm delighted now for session 2, which is looking to the future of EU-Africa partnerships, to introduce Tom Arnold. We heard the Minister speaking very highly of Tom. He is the chair of Ireland's National Task Team on Rural Africa, and also the chair of Ireland's 2030 Agri-Food Strategy Committee. And he was also, as well as one of our previous speakers, recently named as a member of the Champions Network for this 2021 Food Systems Summit. Tom, you're very welcome.
Ella, thank you very much. Can you see me or hear me?
We can both see you and hear you very clearly. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, fine. Well, firstly, look, I'm delighted to follow on from the Minister Coveney, because in all of these issues that we're talking about this morning, he has a very good track record of both interest and expertise in all of these topics, and it's great to hear his reaffirmed commitment to it. And my presentation really wants to pick up from where he left off on 2 key points. Firstly, the recognition that for both Europe and Ireland, Africa is becoming a continent of great strategic importance. And secondly, the emphasis on the importance of food systems. And so I want to try and make a connection here in my brief presentation between what's happening in Ireland, what's happening at European level, in Africa, and more widely at international level. And I'm delighted that in the panel afterwards, we'll have commentary from Leonard, from Francesco, and from Fatma, who I had the pleasure of working with when we were drawing up the Task Force Rural Africa report. I'm going to speak to 4 slides, only 4, to illustrate what I want to say. The first slide is asking the question, how have we got to where we are? And there's an essential key insight here, and it is that this link between food systems, climate, health, and ultimately also the achievement of the SDGs. If we were talking about 10 or 20 years ago, and we were talking about agriculture, agricultural policy, that actually was that really meant expanding production. Now that's no longer an adequate framework of analysis. We're talking about food systems, and we're talking about the links it has with climate policy, with health. And Karina Hawkes described in very, very clearly the nature of these links. The recognition of that central analysis about these links has already led to 2 major shifts in policy. And it is the European Green Deal with really important elements relevant to the agri-food sector of farm to fork and biodiversity strategies, and what we've been talking about, the Food Systems Summit. And we also, of course, have seen over the past 20 years a deepening relationship between Africa and Europe, brought home to us in no small measure during 2015 with the migration crisis. And 2 years ago, I was asked to chair this task force on rural Africa, and we've come up with this report, and we've actually updated it to take account of COVID and the fact that Europe now has a change of policy in terms of the European Green Deal. But the central point here in this report is that Africa's future economic development actually has to be built on a transformation of its agriculture and rural economy. And then, as you say, Ella, we have here in Ireland our own process of examining where our Irish national food strategy should go to the future. And we're hoping to bring that close to a conclusion within the next couple of months. The second slide I want to talk about is the journey ahead. And I want to focus in particular about the decisions to be ahead of us in terms of the European Green Deal, the Food System Summit, and our own agri-food strategy. Because, and you asked this question earlier, Ella, is there an interconnection? I think there is an absolutely clear interconnection between what we do in Ireland, what we commit to and implement in Ireland in terms of our own strategy, and what then we have the credibility to talk about when we want to bring our viewpoints to debates within Europe and at international level. So that's how I see it, that we need to commit and implement a sustainable Irish food system, which can serve as a basis for Irish advocacy towards a sustainable global food system. And I think, and the Minister mentioned this, I think we should be aiming to restore Irish leadership in this field. We had that leadership position about 10 years ago when we were talking about, at that stage, food and nutrition security. Now we need to talk about sustainable food systems, because that's what's relevant at the moment. And in order to do this, it's going to involve acceptance of a vision for the future. It will necessarily involve political commitments. It will also then involve engagement of the private sector, civil society, and the academic sector. And that's what we've just gone through in terms of this exercise that we've done in terms of coming up with a coherent Irish national response to the Task Force Rural Africa report, which in effect we're launching today. And that brings me to the next slide. The National Task Force Team on Rural Africa report, I would call it an Irish part of the journey. And this was founded on, I think, a very good government decision in June of last year, that the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Agriculture should work together to develop this national response. And I think the relationship between these two departments has been exemplary in how it has done this work. And it has brought into play then a much wider range of relevant stakeholders, and we've come up with the report that we have done. The essential conclusion we've reached is that in terms of the multiple relationships that Ireland has with Africa, that it's good work, but it could be better, and it needs more coordination. And we've come up with 6 recommendations that really the spirit of these recommendations is that we build on what we already are doing well, but do it better. We're not advocating any radical structural changes in terms of new structures or anything like that. We're not even advocating a set of measures which require massive extra resources. But we do think that if we can coordinate better, build on what we have, we will definitely achieve better progress both within Africa and also here at home in terms of our own development policy and our own national economy. But we do need to take decisions based on this report and move on and take action. And that brings me to the final point, the journey towards the future. And here it's very much echoing many of the points that have been made this morning. We do see the critical importance of COVID-19. It could reverse years of development progress, as was already said. The term building back better has been used. I'm using a slightly different term, which I'm drawing from Lawrence Haddad, who is a member of our task team, building forward better. And one key point in this, to ensure that nutrition is built into as a routine part into our response to COVID in both economic, food and health sectors. But my final point is one that echoes things that have been already said this morning. It started at the beginning of the day when Johan Swinnen talked about the possibility that we are at a transformative moment. And what we do have to note is the fact that the coming year, 2021, is a moment when political decisions that will shape policy over the next decade will be taken. The European Green Deal, the African AU Summit, the Food System Summit, the Nutrition for Growth meeting, and COP26. We've had a terrible year in many respects in 2020. I think 2021 could be a year of real opportunity. And here, and this is really my final point, I think we have the potential for an Irish voice and leadership in all of these processes. We have great difficulty facing us in many respects, and I'm sure the minister would be very happy if the problem of Brexit could be solved, and if COVID could reduce a bit, and he could start getting to focusing on these issues where I think his heart really is. But I do think that if we can find that political will and space, backed up by support from the public sector and the wider Irish society, there's a real opportunity for Ireland to exercise leadership in this area, and particularly over the next year. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much indeed.
Tom, thank you so much, and raising some really important issues there, not just in terms of Ireland, but then other countries around the world and how they can also contribute at the global level, particularly in context of the Food Summit next year. If I may, Minister Coveney, I see you there, and if I may bring you in on the back of what Tom mentioned, and I have absolutely no doubt that Brexit and COVID, you'd much prefer not to have to deal with them, but deal with them you must. Do you see, however, COVID to be a really critical opportunity to tackle these big issues? It has been put to me that it is, in some ways, one of the biggest opportunities our generation will get to take on board these huge issues globally that we all need to tackle. And there is a positive situation there that can be used, and there is this opportunity that can be grasped.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in truth, if you look at the last number of years, we've seen many countries that should know better, quite frankly, deliberately undermining the multilateral systems that we all rely on, particularly small countries like Ireland, rely on to have, an acceptable level of international rules-based order, if you like, on trade, on response to common challenges like migration and climate and food security and so many other things. And we've seen a shift towards transactional diplomacy, if you like, from many very powerful countries in the world, which I think has been a huge problem. Many would have hoped that COVID would have jolted many of those superpowers and large countries that are influential on many of the multilateral systems that we all are part of, that it would have jolted countries to work together in a much more strategic way based on solidarity at a human level. That hasn't happened. Instead, we've seen a constant series of blame-focused messages coming from certain sources, and of course an undermining of science and medical health advice and so on. So, 2020, as Tom said, has been a bad year on a lot of levels. And so I think many of us who believe in multilateralism and believe that countries need to work together to overcome common challenges, I think 2021 is our year, and we're going to see elections in the weeks ahead that may change some perspectives in that regard. But I think the UN has got to focus on giving global leadership. And those of us who are privileged enough to have some influence, albeit relatively small, in these discussions need to use that to the full extent possible. And Ireland's going to have the privilege of being on the UN Security Council for 2 years, starting from the 1st of January. We will be insisting along with now 10 of the 15 countries that are on the Security Council, that climate change is a global security issue that the UN Security Council needs to focus on and not veto resolutions around in the years ahead. And very much linked to that climate challenge is, of course, the movement of people, which is linked to that, which is migration, and of course, the access to natural resources, and of course, food systems are very much linked to that in terms of water, safe production systems, matching these extraordinary demands that we face together in terms of population growth in some parts of the world, which is going to pose enormous challenges. So, I'm like Tom. I'm an optimist. I think next year can be a transformational year in terms of global politics, and a focus once again on countries working together, as opposed to this sort of bilateral transaction-based approach to international politics and trade, where we see big powers in a constant arm wrestle with each other and forcing other countries to take sides. That is not the way in which we progress the kind of things that you're talking about this morning in terms of relationships between continents like Europe and Africa, and indeed other parts of the world. So next year, I think, is a year where I hope we'll be learning lessons from the mistakes of 2020 and trying to correct them and looking for new beginnings in certain areas that I think can be quite exciting and very positive if we get that right.
And finally, if I may, and briefly, obviously the importance of this multilateral actions, and as you say, dependent also on elections that are happening. But I wonder also in terms of the role of civil society in having their voice heard. So we're looking to this food summit next year, and looking at the other side of things in terms of bottom-up involvement in terms of food policy, agricultural policy, and the kind of voices that we need heard, not just the powerful ones.
Yeah, and I think we know to our cost that if we don't build consensus from the bottom up, well, then directives from the top down generally tend not to work. And while it may well make sense in theory, and we may well have big international conferences where people are speaking to the converted within bubbles, unless we're actually changing the mindset of the people that we're trying to impact on here, which is farm families across continents like Africa and Asia, food companies that are built on the back of that, trying to provide more sustainable supply chains that can provide a living for people first and foremost, but also in a way that is much more sustainable, that protects natural resources and limits emissions. Unless we actually bring that conversation to the streets, we're kind of, I think, going to continue to be speaking to the converted in an intellectual manner that actually doesn't change things in reality for many people. So, if you're somebody who is trying to survive at the moment in poor conditions on small farms, where you see no future for your children, and so you're sending them to big cities because farming is associated with poverty in most parts of the world. And in fact, in many languages, the term farmer and the term peasant has the same word because of this historical association with food production being linked to poverty and in many cases, very, very difficult and hard choices. We've got to try and change that. And Ireland actually is a compelling story in terms of how you change that from, a century of development, from essentially inward-looking food systems to now being a global food supplier and standard setter, hopefully in certain areas. We're far from perfect, by the way. We have a lot of change still to implement in our own systems, because if Ireland wants to be a world leader on sustainable food systems, we've got to start at home. And if we can't point to Ireland practicing what it's preaching internationally, well, then I think we're going to have a credibility problem. So we have work domestically as well, which is why I think the link between the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Foreign Affairs in this space is so important.
Thank you so much, Minister. You reminded me of a
whether
quote.
you've lost me, but I certainly can't see you anymore, but I hope I've answered the question anyway.
You have. Thank you so much, Minister. We're going to let you go now. We're very grateful again for your time and your insights. And it reminds me of a quote from Dr. Martin Frick. I don't know whether Martin is there, because we're going to move on now, but he did say we really have to understand farmers in a different way, in particular family and smallholder farmers, because these are the people who keep our life supports intact. Tom, we're going to come back to you and talk a little bit more about these questions that have been raised, but I'm going to move on now to get some perspectives and responses to this theme in session 2 of EU-Africa Partnership Looking to the Future. And I'm very pleased to introduce now Leonard Mizzi, European Commission Director General for International Cooperation and Development. And Leonard is the head of unit at the European Commission in this Director General for International Cooperation and Development. His area of specialization are governance, agriculture, and food and nutrition security. Leonard, I'm going to pass it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ella. And first of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting us. And always a pleasure when Tom speaks about EU-Africa relations. Given that we have worked so closely in 2018 with our DG Agri colleagues. So that is a lesson learned. Dismantling silos and working really transversely across different departments, different ministries, in our case, different commission services. If we really want to work on a systems approach, and Martin mentioned how complex it is, because it's good to organize summits, it's good to build a strong process around action tracks, but how more difficult it is to involve all colleagues from different lines of action, trade, climate, external relations, common agricultural policy, DG Sante from an SPS issue, animal health, animal welfare. I think, and Martin mentioned it earlier on, we have a window of opportunity of 1 year where we need to show not only being a people summit and an action-oriented one, but also showing that we mean business and we can show impact on the ground. And if we can start building the blocks to culminate in the pre-summit in July and in the General Assembly in 2021, we can show this sense of leadership. And as European Union across the different services, and as DEFCO, we are coordinating a bit a one-stop shop in terms of the UN Food System Summit. First of all, we have had the Foreign Affairs Council in September, and the European Council conclusions a few days ago mentioned agri-food systems as a key deliverable, a key priority area, together with digital, knowledge, renewable energy, transport, and health. And even if we look at the other areas like digital, we need really to unleash and build on the work of the EU-Africa Task Force and the work also that Ireland has unveiled today to really unleash the full potential, for example, of digital technology. There is a lot of talk about digital, mainly on mobile telephony. But I think if we want to attract young people, especially in Africa, the figure which strikes me always is that we need to create around 1 million jobs per month in Africa. Now, creating 1 million jobs per month in Africa is not an easy process, especially because when we go and discuss with ministries across the African continent, very few really know exactly in which sectors, which are the absorptive sectors to create so many jobs per month. I'm not saying that agriculture and agribusiness is the only one, clearly, however, it has an important role if it is transformative, and digital is part of the transformation as much as is the research component. And we as European Union are strong believers in the transformation on agriculture research for development, together with our RTD and DG Agri colleagues on Horizon Europe. But I think with the DESIRA initiative, which is our sort of flagship on agriculture research for development, we are also giving a bit the signals of where we want to head in the next financial period, 2021-2027, with a focus more on agroecology, with a focus more on soil conservation, on water management, on climate change. And this is what also Minister Coveney mentioned in terms of the EU Green Deal and the Farm to Fork. The timeliness of this meeting is very good as well, because earlier on this week, we have had the agri-fish ministers in Luxembourg agreeing after some months the Farm to Fork conclusions, which also have, besides an internal angle, an external angle. The external angle is not really a long section of the Farm to Fork conclusions. However, we have the necessary hooks, and we have already started engaging in CODEV, which is the Council Working Party, which is preparing also the pre-programming process of the NDC instrument, which is the instrument post-2020, trying to build a new narrative on agri-food systems, which could hopefully take us to the UN Food System Summit within a year's time. And what we have been already testing with a number of member states, including Ireland, and we have 12 other member states. And I would like maybe that we have 27 member states like Ireland, who really are firm believers, strong believers in this transformation process, to really put agri-food systems at the top of the European agenda. Yes, everyone today in all the 27 member states clearly speak about health, because health is clearly needs to be addressed. We see the figures every day in our capitals, which are alarming. However, we also need to recognize that beyond the European Union, there are millions who are being impacted by a food crisis. We have the baseline figure of December 2019 of 135 million in acute food crisis. The estimate that WFP is giving these days is around 270 million. What we clearly know is that an additional 100 million from the baseline of 2019 are being pushed into acute food crisis, and the numbers are increasing on a daily basis. This clearly will have major implications on migration flows, on tensions, on conflicts, compounded evidently by pests and diseases in the African continent. We know of the desert locusts, where the European Union, through humanitarian and also development funds, has also responded strongly. However, what is important is, and this morning we had a discussion with the World Food Programme, is that we need really to put multilateralism at the core of the agenda. We will not solve problems in a piecemeal approach if it's just the EU with the member states. Yes, the EU and member states are amongst the biggest donors, but we need to have all hands on deck. And we are clearly, evidently following what will happen in the US in the coming weeks, because we really need to have also the US on board. We need to have all the big players on board to actually tackle this crisis. And I just give one or two examples of what we are trying to do to build up this building block. Around value chains, we are under the EU Green Deal process, starting with cocoa, looking into sustainable cocoa value chains. We know how cocoa is also a controversial topic around deforestation, around child labor, and around living income. So we have launched a multi-stakeholder dialogue a month ago to actually, in a civil society process, across the board, across the value chain, including farming communities, including cooperatives in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and hopefully in other countries like Cameroon, Nigeria, and other Latin American countries, we start engaging into a holistic approach of additional values in terms of the chocolate bar which is consumed in our supermarkets, and that chocolate bar is truly sustainable from all angles, and what is the transformation process that is required, also with a strong policy dialogue based also on the experiences that we had in the EU Rural Africa Task Force, including amongst others agribusiness platforms, which are multi-stakeholder, truly multi-stakeholder, involving also the NGO community and civil society organizations. So that is one pathway. Value chains. If we want really to be transformational in Africa, we need to have much higher intra-regional trade in Africa. Less than 20% of trade is traded amongst the African countries. This has to increase substantially to the levels that we are used to in the European Union or in Asia if we really want to actually create those jobs on a monthly basis. Secondly, nutrition. We have just unveiled 2 reports in CODEV in the last month. We are on track on our commitments in terms of a portfolio until 2020 of 3.5 billion. However, we are struggling to be on track on the 7 million stunting by 2025. So we are also looking in a Team Europe approach in a pre-programming phase to put nutrition at the core of the human development targets of the future programming. Because with COVID, we know that the most vulnerable will be, amongst others, women and kids, small children, especially in the first 1,000 days. This needs to continue being prioritized, and I know that Ireland is prioritizing nutrition amongst other topics within the food systems approach. Last but not least, we have, and we are proud to have, the Global Network Against Food Crisis, which is our contribution to better coordination in the multilateral fora. Minister Coveney mentioned the resolutions in the UN Security Council. One of the resolutions we track is the resolution on conflict and hunger, which was steered by the Netherlands 2 years ago. And it is important, if we really want solutions in the Yemens, in the horns of Africa, or in the Sahel, we need really to tackle conflict. And Michael mentioned land. We are a supporter of issues around land tenure, because you can't have solutions which tackle food and nutrition if you don't tackle access to natural resources and access to issues around agro-pastoralism. So in this systemic approach, we would like to engage with Ireland and the other member states to truly have potentially sustainable agri-food systems initiative in Africa, because we think and we consider that this is the core priority for the next multi-financial framework, and involving civil society organizations, involving the member states, and get this launched as soon as possible during the course of 2021. Over to you, Ella.
Thank you so much, Leonard. And you know, you speak of the importance of building a new narrative on agricultural systems, and you know, I suppose there's so much to talk about there, and including how a wider range of voices, not least women, as we've heard repeatedly this morning, can be involved in this building. But maybe we can come back to that at the end of this session, when hopefully we will have time for some Q&As. And for that reason, I'm going to keep going to the next speaker, who is Francesco Rampa. And Francesco is the head of program for sustainable food systems at the European Centre for Development Policy Management, based in Brussels. It's a leading independent think tank that wants to make policies in Europe and Africa work for inclusive and sustainable development. Francesco was also a member of the EU Task Force Rural Africa. Francesco, you're very welcome. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, and it's a great honor and pleasure, and thanks to the organizer to come after such a distinguished panel. My perspective would be about coherence and coordination, and about a good system approach, linking to a number of the points made by the previous speakers. First of all, I think that Europe and Africa, in this context of recovering post-COVID and strengthening the sustainability of food systems, should together, but also in Europe and Africa independently, achieve better policy coherence. And also it's a lot about how the public and the private sector work together. And also it's a lot about how Europe and Africa can do a lot more together in the context of all the processes that are happening, especially next year. So to the issue of policy coherence, just to briefly mention, one is of course trade. There's a lot that's going to happen and is happening on international trade in relation to food systems, and Europe And Africa should find a way to better make international trade also serving the purpose of sustainable food systems. Without going much into this debate, that's pretty crucial. You can do a lot of things about programming aid, financial resources, but if we don't fix better trade for sustainable food systems, including shorter value chain, not necessarily looking at export-oriented agriculture, but really trying to use the dynamics of regional trade in Africa to strengthen local food systems, that would be crucial. In general, I also would say that a food system approach, like we recommended in the Task Force Rural Africa, is in itself a way to keep coherence in a number of the policy areas we're talking about: nutrition, climate resilience, economic growth, social protection, etc. So by itself, that's why in the Task Force Rural Africa, we recommended that the Europe and Africa, in their future joint agenda on agriculture and food system, take a food system approach to coordinate all these policy areas and to coordinate all of the important actors in a food system that we have heard about today. And to me, honestly, as Thomas said, when we were looking at how to update our report of the Task Force Rural Africa after COVID, we recommended for the two sides, Europe and Africa, to take a One Health approach that other speakers have mentioned. And to me, a One Health approach follows the same purpose, trying to make people, prosperity, and planet basically coordinated as objectives and an action. And it is the same that you can do in the specific case of food systems by looking at all of the dimensions together. Not only you need coherence in trade, but as I said, I think you need much better coherence on what the private and the public sector are doing, both in Europe and Africa and together in this system. So there's a huge opportunity in all the blending instruments that Europe has planned, billions and billions of money planned to be stimulated through using public resources like ODA for the sake of sustainable development. There is an external investment plan that promises to leverage so many billions euros with using European ODA resources. I think that's great, but is not really serving yet the agriculture and food sector. So the European investment plan, we also said in the Task Force Rural Africa, should be geared and making these blending financial instruments much more geared toward the agriculture and food players, especially the smallholder players, the SMEs, the missing middle, the ones who can really connect urban and rural areas to make the food system more resilient. These are not reached by this type of investments in Europe, and there's much more that can be done that. Of course, I think in general, as many have mentioned before, 2021 has a great opportunity for a coherent action of all these European actors in what they do in Africa. Of course, the Africans also need to do a lot of choices at their policy level, including through the continental free trade area, but engaging as Team Europe in a more modern way, all the relationships with Africa in setting together a course towards a sustainable food system is going to be, of course, crucial how the individual embassies of European member states, including Ireland, how the European Union delegation take this food system approach into practice. They transform all of their action into much more coherent action to serve sustainable food system purposes by using the programming of resources public. That's certainly something that the European actors, Irish, should be doing, including Ireland, including through the coordination of EU delegation. But as others have mentioned, I think 2021 also has global governance offer a great opportunity. I remember hearing Karina today speaking of governance and also spending differently as two crucial steps going forwards. And I think there Europe and Africa can have a much stronger, much more pragmatic influence to the global scene. If Europe and Africa work together in all of these summits for next year that we're talking about, the Food System Summit, the EU-Africa Summit itself, COP26, Europe and Africa stand the chance to influence positively the governance towards sustainable food systems. They can influence not only the governance, but also the way money should be spent differently, as Karina has said. So if you think of repurposing agricultural subsidies, could be a test of how Europe and Africa talk concretely about their respective agricultural policy towards common objective. Spending better existing money in agricultural services that go towards fertilizer and harmful negative externalities type of spending towards food systems spending that can be more nutritious, more climate resilience would be a great to the rest of the world, and that may be contribution to the
So I wonder, have we lost Francesco there?
There is the European, there is also the Italian presidency of the G20, that is a European, the G7 is being headed by UK. So I think by having this, my organization, ECDPM, will also be supporting the Italian presidency. We hope that through acting inside the G20, for example, the Europeans and the Africans can coordinate to have positive outcomes there. So I see a lot of potential for EU Africa working as a bloc towards sustainable food systems. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. And I will just put one very brief, if you can, question to you, which is echoing what Karina Hawke said earlier about the need for courageous governance, and the question also of whether there is enough of a skill set at governance level to address these big issues.
Well, we have a gap given the ambition. But you do have connectors. I mean, what in Europe with these task forces, what the Irish process has just been doing, you actually show by example that you can bring people together, very different from smallholder farmers to exporters to government officials. So a number of us, including my own organization, are trying to operate at that level by connecting sectors. So as Karina said, system connectors, system thinkers are a way to go. There are examples, they need to be a scale, but also what the European Union headquarters in Brussels, as Leonard Mitzi just said, they are bringing in a number of key stakeholders to connect sectors and actors at different levels. And I think if you scale up these examples, if you empower the connectors, it was very interesting to hear also the preparation of the Food System Summit, ambition to be very inclusive, etc., etc. I think that the skill gap can be relatively quickly filled. So I'm pretty, the enthusiasm that we heard about in the preparation of the Food System Summit, if we all come on board towards the same objectives, I think these skill sets are emerging from the ground, and they need to be placed in the right policy processes. We need to be opening up these policy processes, certainly, but I think there is enough skills around. You just need to connect them to the right policy process at the right moment.
Thank you so much, Francesco. And I hope you can stay on if we get time to do a question and answer session. I'm going to introduce now, delighted to introduce Jane Wasindi. Jane represents the Agricultural Sector Board of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. And this alliance is the voice of the private sector in Kenya. And it's the umbrella body for the private sector associations and corporate bodies in all sectors of the economy. Jane, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to you now for your responses.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us to share our perspectives on this very important conversation. Kepsa, can you hear me well?
I hear you very well, and we can see you too. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. So the KEPSA, Kenya Private Sector Alliance, is an alliance of business member organizations in Kenya, and we are separated into 14 sector boards, which mirrors the government ministries, so that there's more open and purposeful dialogue between private sector and government bodies. So first of all, it is crucial to point out that private sector accounts for 80% of Kenya's GDP, which makes us the key driver of the economy. Economy is largely dependent on agriculture, which accounts for 34% of GDP, and a further 27% through linkages with manufacturing, distribution, and other service sectors. Nearly 60% of Kenya's exports are agro-based, tea, coffee, horticulture, and nearly 70% of rural economies based on agriculture. About 75% of production comes from smallholder farmers, making them crucial to our country's food security and nutrition agenda. They must therefore be included in any partnerships as active participants, as opposed to how it has been as being points of consideration for any intervention to yield significant impact. So KEPSA being the apex body for private sector in Kenya, we have played a pivotal role in overall bringing together all stakeholders in the agriculture sector to engage government and other partners in coming up with different strategies and policies to address the challenges affecting the sector's productivity. We participated in the development of the 10-year Agriculture Sector Transformation and Growth Strategy, ASTGS, which runs from 2019 to 2029, which was a major milestone, placing stronger focus on smallholder farmers and value chain development, while recognizing the importance of private sector collaboration. The sector has 9 flagships that are expected to increase smallholder incomes, increase agricultural output and value addition, and boost household food resilience. In February this year, KEPSA realized that we were uncoordinated as a private sector. So we hosted the inaugural National Agriculture Summit and launched the Agriculture Sector Network, ASNET, as an umbrella body bringing together all industry players to spearhead the transformation agenda and ensure harmonized approach in addressing the sector challenges. ASNET's key role is to coordinate agriculture sector actors in Kenya through various mechanisms to engage in policy advocacy that promotes productivity, competitiveness, and attracts investment into the agriculture sector. Since agriculture is a devolved function in Kenya, KEPSA is working closely with the Ministry of Agriculture and county governments on this. In terms of partnership, last month, KEPSA members Bayer East Africa Limited and ASNET donated 170,000 liters of pesticide worth 100 million to the Kenyan and Ugandan governments to aid the fight against desert locust invasion. As one of my fellow panelists alluded to, we have had the first wave of locusts. We are being told there's a second wave coming. This will help in safeguarding food security and also ensure businesses continue accessing inputs. During the COVID-19 period, KEPSA partnered with its members in the agriculture and health sector to distribute flowers to the local hospitals and key markets in Europe under a Flowers of Hope initiative. This was aimed at spreading a message of hope and solidarity with the frontline health workers and maintain thousands of jobs in the floriculture industry. To ensure market opportunities for smallholder farmers, KEPSA is championing for local sourcing of inputs by different manufacturers under our supplier diversity initiative. Some major companies who are members have engaged thousands of farmers in their supply chains through contract farming. This includes East Africa Breweries Limited that has a network of 60,000 farmers supplying sorghum in arid and semi-arid areas. And then there's Bidco Africa Limited that has a network of 30,000 farmers across East Africa region who supply oil seeds, inclusive of soya beans and sunflower, among others. Capacity development is key to improve capacity, especially for SMEs and smallholder farmers. There's many trade negotiations coming on now. There's the Africa Free Continental Agreements. There's the regional East Africa Community Agreement. So there's really a need to bring our smallholder farmers up to speed with the trade requirements, for example, standards that will require them and enable them participate in our regional and continental trade partnerships. So KEPSA is partnering with Educate Global Rapid Technical Assistance Response Team to support businesses in food, health, education sectors through financial restructuring, strategic review, and addressing critical operational issues they face. KEPSA is also running a COVID-19 recovery resilience program in partnership with MasterCard Foundation aimed at supporting 400 MSMEs financially with interest-free loans of up to 1.5 million shillings, repayable within 6 months, amongst others. Under the food security agenda, KEPSA is pursuing the public-private partnerships, PPPs, and joint ventures at national and county level in irrigation farming, development of food storage facilities, and other critical infrastructure, food processing, production of farm inputs, animal feeds, and modern technologies. KEPSA also supports programs by the EU, among other partners that have invested heavily in transforming agriculture value chains and supporting smallholder farmers, e.g., for example, through the Agrify Kenya Challenge Fund and the recently launched AgriBiz program that seeks to provide training, business advisory, and funding to 2,400 women and youth-led agribusinesses. Some of our members participate in various other initiatives from the EU. For example, the horticulture industry players participate under COLIACP programs, the Fit for Market, where more smallholders are brought onto the grid so that they can have access to the export market. Thank you. Over to you, Ella.
Jane, thank you so much. It's very interesting to hear you outline the extensive initiatives and projects that are going on there and that you're involved in. I'm going to move straight on, if that's okay, to the next speaker. Welcome Fatima Ben Rajeb. Fatima is the CEO of the Pan-African Farmers Organization, which is based in Kigali in Rwanda. This is Africa's first continent-wide farmer organization, and it aims to really direct farmer engagement on Africa's growth and development agenda. Fatima, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Ella. So, as you said, PAFO is the Pan-African Farmers Organization. It's the platform of the farmers, the voices, carrying out the voices of dozens of millions of farmers in around 50 African countries. And through this platform, when we think about policies and the strategies that are required to achieve rural transformation, first, to achieve rural transformation, this means a very wide range of policies and strategies which encompass the improvement of rural people livelihoods through the improvement of infrastructure, the access to social utilities like education and health, the access to water, electricity, ICTs, make closer the financial and cultural services, etc. But to be more specific to the sectors we belong to, all these improvements will facilitate the agricultural sector's transformation, which need much more involvement of the policymakers and more impactful policies and strategies. First, enhancing the implementation related policies at the continental level. The African Union has in place a number of relevant policies and strategies that take recognitions of national and regional development policies, plans and strategies of member states that are beneficial to farmers. These should be effectively implemented in a coordinated manner. Then, honoring the commitments under CAADP, we have spoken for a long time about CAADP, where governments are expected to increase investment level in agriculture by allocating at least 10% of national budgets to agriculture and rural development, and to achieve agricultural growth rates of at least 6% per annum. Then enhancing direct support to the family farmers. For example, in periods of crisis like this one, pandemic, natural disasters, etc., to access emergency funds without repayment conditions. Then maximizing opportunities in farming and agro-processing on the African continent. This should be done through continental strategies and initiatives to connect farmers among themselves and farmers to markets on the continent. In addition, more capacity building programs should be enhanced to empower African farmers for them to work at their full potential on local food crops. Some of the intrinsically related factors contributing to the poor agricultural performance include outdated technologies as well as inadequate financing for the sector. In this regard, therefore, ensuring sustainable farming will require enhanced mechanization of the sector, use of green energy, and empowering rural farmers, mostly women, who are the majority players. Increased mechanization in farming will require that the energy demands are met by increasing the availability of fuel and electrical power in the rural areas. Then promoting innovation and digitalization in agriculture. And here we need really the involvement of the private sector. The need to innovate, expand, and promote the use of digital tools in agriculture has never been as pressing as or opportune as during this Covid-19 crisis. Public interventions are needed to promote the digital transformation of agriculture and include smallholders as well. Connecting farmers. The connectivity makes it possible for the services to reach farmers through mobile and online means. With such means, farmers may also access e-marketing. Additional support for their organizations will allow trainings, scaling up best practices already implemented by farmers' organizations, overcoming the challenges of transport and movement, for example, in such a pandemic period, etc. Utilizing the African Continental Free Trade Area to promote farming and farm products on the African market. It is a unique opportunity for Africa to unleash its economic potential for inclusive growth and sustainable development. It is believed that the arrangement will create a single African market of more than 1 billion consumers with a combined GDP of 2.5 trillion USD. Among others, it aims to promote agricultural transformation and growth in Africa and contribute to food security, as well as improve competitiveness through regional agricultural value chains development while focusing on the local food system. And here, please allow me, Ella, to go through. I don't know if you hear me or if my connection has
we can hear
stopped.
we can hear you very well, And we can
okay, perfect. So allow me to come back also to one sentence said by Tom regarding the COVID could reverse years of development progress. And perhaps the minister has mentioned to avoid mistakes of 2020. Allow me to say perhaps this COVID will allow us to rethink the development of efforts and perhaps avoid rather the mistakes of the last 50 years. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Fatima, very much for that. Tom, she did mention you there. I wonder if you'd like to quickly respond. Just unmute yourself if you can.
Sure. Thanks, Ella. I think that a general theme coming through is that we just have to maybe rethink about the future. And I think there are lessons to be learned short term and, as Fatma says, longer term. I do think we're going to have to go back to a much more sustainable way of farming. And that needs to be a more decisive shift than we've seen thus far. So I think it's all for debate. And I think next year with the Food System Summit, as was said earlier, is going to be one of the forums for that debate.
And Tom, just finally, would you agree with what Karina said earlier about the need for courageous governance here at this moment of time,
Well, that's a very big question, and governance, we can talk about governance of food systems, which is one thing, but there's a bigger question about governance and governance within Africa, which is another set of very big issues. I think we always need courageous governance. I think hopefully after, let me be very partisan, if we get the right result in the American election in 2 weeks' time, I think there may be a chance for a general rethink of what represents governance both at national level and a more effective multilateralism that has been fading away in the last number of years.
Indeed. Thank you, Tom, for that. And I'm delighted to introduce our final speaker before I hand it over to Charles Spillane, and that is Million Bile. Million is the coordinator of the African Food Sovereignty Alliance, which is based in Ethiopia, and it brings together small-scale food producers, farmers, pastoralists, fishermen and fisherwomen, women, youth and activists from around the continent of Africa to create a united and louder voice for food sovereignty. Million, you're very welcome. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces here. And thank you so much, Ella, for bringing the issue of civil society, reminding every speaker to say something about civil society. That's very much appreciated. I'm going to speak about agriculture-related issues because over 70% of our people are engaged with it. The GDP of our countries, the larger amount, between 20 up to 50% of our GDP depends on agriculture. It can be a major employer, and also most of the challenges that we have, urban challenge, environmental challenges, and cultural challenge, climate challenge, they come from the agriculture-related issues. So agriculture is very critical. So there are two visions for our agriculture. I would call one a kind of a productivist vision, a productivist narrative, or a productivist paradigm. I think this vision is, if you look at EU relationships, relationships with other northern countries, it's based on this productivist narrative. It's market-based, it's value addition, it's using chemicals and also high input varieties in whatever for production. Space is a constant focus. Is focusing on few crops and to increase productivity and have income. It is very important to increase productivity. I'm not saying that it's not important, but nobody talks about true cost accounting of this approach in terms of the environment, in terms of health, in terms of also the society. There are other things that are equally important. I'm so happy that Tom, Leo, and others talked about nutrition. Nutrition is very much important. Health is very much important. It's coming into the topic. And when you develop a policy including nutrition, productivity, and environment, the biosphere, then the kind of policy changes, the kind of policy imperative will change. But there is one thing that nobody here talked about, and it's actually forgotten almost everywhere, which is culture. I don't feel comfortable when people talk about agribusiness or agri-food or whatever. It's agriculture. Basically, agriculture is a cultural activity. And I've been traveling all over Europe, and I could see a lot of cultural activities related to agriculture in Europe. In Africa, it's a base of everything. And there's one element also that's forgotten, but it's mentioned here and there, which is human rights, a rights-based approach. So any agricultural activity that we do has to take productivity, has to take nutrition, has to take health, has to take a biosphere in our environment, has to take our culture and human rights. It has to include all this. And what kind of vision would take all this? I think for us, we say agroecology that in the bigger concepts of, or in the bigger context of food sovereignty. Why? I think research is showing increasingly that agroecology increases productivity. Why agroecology is good for nutrition? Because it's based on diverse food. The food that's produced is diverse. Why? Agroecology is very good for the environment, for the climate. You can talk about adaptation, you can talk about mitigation using agroecology, and also it increases biodiversity, especially agrobiodiversity, which is very much critical. Why? Agroecology is based on the knowledge of people, on the culture of people. It's cultural activity. And the production and also the economic activity is controlled by the people. And I'm not saying that producing more food or value chain defined in a broader way wouldn't add value to agroecology. It would add. So that's why we say agroecology is a practice, and it's also a science, it's a cutting-edge science, and also it's a social movement. That's why we're engaging in a social movement. And I'm interested in the TFRA, in the 4 strategies that that it's recommending an under African agenda for rural transformation. And I like basically the territorial approach for income and job creation. In general, it comes from another concept which was practiced in some European countries, but it's good as a concept. But I think AU and EU relationships are somehow, to some extent, are problematic in some senses. They could be better because we don't even know who sets the agenda. You know, the power is with the money, the power is with the political power, and the political power and the money power rests with the European Union. And I could see the agendas of the AU-EU summit, and some of them, you know, some critical agenda like the food system agenda is not there. So who sets the agenda is very critical. And where does this vision for AU comes from is a very, very important question for us. But even though I like the territorial approach for income and job creation under the EU, I think there are some precautionary notes from the civil society. One is it looks like it's a blanket approach, you know. There is a diversity in African continent. There is even diversity in one country. I come from Ethiopia. I'm an Ethiopian. You go to southern Ethiopia, eastern Ethiopia, northern Ethiopia. It's totally different, the food system. So does it allow that level of diversity is very much important. And there is also some level of conflation of values, you know. When you add value, what kind of value do you add? Is it economic value only, or is social value that you add in productivity? The digitization, I like digitization. I think this will be my final note. But we have a huge question around digitization. Huge. Where will the data be stored? Who stores the data? Who controls data? Who controls the production of this instrument, the digital instruments? Now we're talking about, you know, the digitalization of even genetic structures, you know. I mean, a lot of companies have started coding the digital information of crops and producing these crops without even the importance of the need for those crops to be present. Somebody can take the genetical code of a teff, for example, Ethiopian crop, and they can reproduce teff somewhere else. Who controls that? I think that's very much important. I mean, digitization is good, very good, but how? There has to be a conscious regulation. We don't even have regulations around digitization in Africa. Nothing. So we have to have that kind of mechanisms before we enter into the European Union on agreement around digitization. I think that should proceed instead of the rush to introduce digitization into Africa. And the PPP is also, you know, is always a question of power relationship under the public and private partnership. You know, who is partnering with whom? You know, the small scale farmers, who is partnering on behalf of the small scale farmers? These are all important questions. Thank you, Ella. You are muted.
There you go. Thank you so much for that, Million. And I feel like you have just raised a whole cohort of really, really important questions. And you know, these are questions interesting that I know some farmers, some smaller farmers in Ireland are also asking themselves. And I just wonder, Million, and I would also put it to you, Fatma, what do you think that the European Commission can learn from your own experiences? Million, perhaps starting from you, in terms of addressing some of these questions.
I mean, for example, in terms of production, I mean, one shocking, there were some shocking reports recently. The support that comes from bigger development institutions to agroecology is 2%, maximum 5%, even that is stretching the definition of agroecology. Over 90% of the support to agriculture into Africa comes to industrial-based agriculture, to the productivist paradigm that I said. I think that has to shift somehow. That's one thing. The second thing is, in any Europe and in African relationship, we have to participate. You know, we have to. We don't know what's happening, and that's not right. The participation of the African civil society in these discussions, in these negotiations, in all these things is almost nil. You know, we don't know. So that's the second most important thing. And also, it's good for the even for Europe that we have examples of good, really good practices on ground. We are studying them, documenting them, and publishing them. I think any future for us should be based on that. And I think we need to look at this research that we ourselves are doing, and base our relationship on that.
Fatma, just if you can unmute yourself there and perhaps give a brief comment.
A brief comment on what, Ella? So I totally agree with for farmers' organizations, there is a dilemma because we have several heads. And the first head, I will say that it belongs, so farmers and farmers' organizations belong to private sector, because the first investors in Africa are the farmers themselves. We don't think about farmers when they are small hoarders or poor, or no, this is not the case. They are the first investors, and this is why they are considered by some policymakers as private sector. The second head is civil society, because the first ones who are lobbying, who are advocating for their rights to have their voices heard are farmers' organizations as well. So I totally agree. But I can say that we are involved as farmers' organizations, at least. We are involved in several discussions. We are supported by European Union, perhaps much more than African institutions, to involve the smallholder farmers, the family farmers in the value chains, to be a real actor and to show what we are doing and what we can do. And lastly, we have so many examples and so many best practices that need to be scaled up, that need to be supported, that certainly we can add a value to all these efforts of development that are done in Africa.
Thank you. I just want to very briefly bring in Leonard Mizzi from the European Commission there. Leonard, if you could unmute yourself. I mean, you have heard, hopefully, the contributions from Million and Fatma, and this question of who sets the agenda, this idea, fundamentally, I understand it, as I understand it, is the idea of fairness within the system and the importance of making sure that it's not just power and money in food and farm policy that gets its way, the importance of small farmers, the role of small farmers, of women, of people on the ground, and of integrating cultural, social, and human rights perspectives in these big policies. And even when we look at the Food Summit next year, making sure that's integrated too. And I will ask, perhaps you have a comment on that.
So as Fatma said, we are strong proponents and supporters of farmers' organizations. If we want solutions in Africa, they need to be domestic and steered, led by African actors. Hence, we are trying to strengthen as much as possible farmers' organizations to actually scale up in the value chains. With what Million said, evidently, this is also a shift, policy shift of the EU Green Deal and the Farm to Fork conclusions, which, for example, mentions a lot of organic agriculture and sustainable agri-food systems. This was almost unheard of 20, 25 years ago. Yes, we still support a more production-oriented approach in Africa, but I mentioned the ZERA. There is a shift in our external financing on more agroecology, although we know if I go to the FAO, I am bashed by a number of countries, by a number of constituencies around the concept of agroecology, because this is not well understood, and that is also an important role, that with the evidence we come and communicate better that agroecology is a possible pathway from a livelihoods dimension, but also from a sustainability dimension. In terms of data, evidently, we have best practices in terms of data protection. It's important that these are safeguarded because there are quite a number of sharks out there in terms of data accessibility and genetic resources. But it's important in terms of agenda setting that civil society have also an important role to play at national level. And within our policy dialogue, I mentioned the case of cocoa, we are involving civil society, NGOs, including the development NGOs. But first of all, you need to be empowered at national level, you need to be organized at national level, and clearly, if you communicate this to the African Union Commission, there is an African Union Commissioner, Mrs. Sako, to actually defend the role of civil society organizations, then the European Union will clearly accommodate this. But as you know, it takes two to tango, and the demands out there today are so big. And that's why I said this is a window where agri-food systems and the rights-based approach will be higher on the agenda, because 2021 is a year full of events, not least Nutrition for Growth, UN Food Systems Summit, CBD, COP. All these processes converge on what we have been discussing today. If we don't grasp it as well in the EU-Africa Summit, I don't know when we would grasp it. So if you from your side, we from our side, converge also with the African Union to put this high on the agenda, evidently, we should put it on the agenda where also civil society can have a role.
Thank you very much, Leonard. And Francesco, to bring you in there, and also Tom, just finally for a brief word each to conclude this session. Francesco.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree. The sense I get today is that there is a need for coordination and bringing the enthusiasm and some of the criticism Million has just expressed into probably into an independent process to accompany the Food System Summit preparation, I would say. I mean, there's always a need to make sure everyone is included, but you can't force everyone to be sometimes engaged at the same level of governments, etc. So I would see, given we still have a bit of time, the need to accompany what we were presented today as the formal Food System Summit preparation with a bit more informal dialogue, maybe country-based, evidence-based, but we really, some of the NGOs and the farmers organization bottom up explaining what is maybe the ideal outcome of certain of the EU-Africa or Food System Summit preparation. And I think if you take that a bit more gradually, that could be end up as a very good contribution to the formalities of EU summits, EU-Africa summits, Food System Summit, etc. So I would be happy also as a CDPM would work with Irish and others to try and see to what extent that independence, a non-official, non-government to government atmosphere can be built around some of the key decisions next year.
Thank you so much. Tom. I just press the unmute button there, please, Tom. Sorry. There you go.
Yeah, I think it was, I think, somewhat disturbing to hear Martin Frick talk about what sounded like a standoff between the people who are organizing the summit and broader civil society. It would be a pity if we can't find ways of making sure that there is a proper engagement with civil society into this process. And I'm very aware of some of the suspicions, etc., that have traditionally been there, but we need to find creative ways around, I think, finding ways to get around them. I come back then to Leonard's final comment that, you know, we really do have an opportunity in 2021 to make progress, to think in terms of, you know, building back from COVID, building forward. And there's a number of set piece events there which can serve that purpose. And I suppose my basic point in my presentation was that Ireland needs to get its own act together and make up its mind how it's going to participate and move toward that leadership role that I think it can have. I think there's many of the elements are there. I think government departments are willing to work together. We've found ways before of making sure that a wider stakeholder group can work towards a vision in a coherent way. And, you know, in a strange way, I think, not a strange way, but in a way, I think this morning's webinar, as Leonard said earlier, is extremely timely, but it is perhaps a platform upon which to move towards, you know, our national preparation for a substantial and leadership role for a progressive agenda from 2021 onwards.
Tom, thank you so much. And thank you to all our contributors for this session. I'm mindful that we're all on different time zones, and I'm very, very grateful to you all for your clear contributions, for answering the questions so clearly. And I hope that you can all stay safe during this time of COVID, and also share the fact that this video will be available on YouTube, because, you know, these discussions can't just be seen by a small number of people. The more people involved, the better. But I'm now going to sign off and say thank you again, and pass over to Galway to Professor Charles Spillane for the final word. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ella, and thanks to all the speakers and the participants today. I'm just going to wrap up with a few kind of reflections. I've been listening attentively to all of the speakers and watching the various questions that have been coming in on the live chat. And well, one reflection is that perhaps the title for today's conference should have been really a COVID-19 and sustainable food systems, a fire drill for transforming food systems in times of crisis. And we're in the midst of that fire drill at the moment, and will be for the next year to 2021 and beyond as we head on to 2030. And the question of courageous political leadership for our policymakers really, it kind of points to the need for courage that is needed to shift from emergency mode responses that we're in right now, and necessarily so, to more strategic transition pathway responses that would position us better for food security, climate change, biodiversity, and sustainability challenges that we will inevitably face in the future. So one narrative that is coming from this conference, I think, is that the building back efforts that are underway, which are business as usual, we may be wasting an opportunity for charting transformation pathways to more resilient, equitable, and sustainable horizon points. Like Sonia was highlighted, that very few of the COVID-19 stimulus packages have any climate conditionalities in their responses, and yet $1 trillion a year is needed for transitioning to renewables. And yet we still have stimulus packages that are focusing on fossil fuels and carbon intensive pathways. So there is, an opportunity, and the opportunity is right now. It's not in 5 years' time. It's not in 10 years' time. The opportunity is right now in terms of charting pathways that are aligned with decarbonisation pathways as we try to exit from the COVID-19 situation. Karina likewise has also pointed towards such opportunities and makes very valid recommendations to the Food Systems 2021 Summit on the possibilities and the opportunities to reconfigure economic systems to focus more on nutritious foods. Joe at the outset, Johan Swinnen, highlighted the poor and are most disproportionately affected by COVID-19, and so it's really laid bare the inequalities in our food systems, which is really going to pose major challenges for the ambition of reaching the furthest behind first. Indeed, there's a series of papers that came out, I think, in the past week or two that suggested from the Ceres 2030 initiative that of all the agricultural research studies that have been done to date, 95% of them do not have any meaningful focus on smallholder farmers. And so this kind of takes me on to where Melissa was highlighting, that she highlighted that there are opportunities, there are community-driven opportunities, there are national-driven opportunities, and she pointed to 4 Ds for food system change: directions, diversity, distribution, and democracy. And I'd argue that we should add an additional D to that called debate. And that debate at a Food Systems Summit can really enable, because we do need more consensus towards understanding what transformation pathways are needed. And the Food Systems Summit should really play a major role in building consensus amongst different stakeholders of what those transition or transformation pathways are towards more sustainable futures, because they are quite contested between different stakeholder groups. So to build that consensus, it's important that the discussions and dialogues are not happening in echo chambers where we're preaching to the converted. We do have to I suppose, develop a food systems sustainability diplomacy, which involves entering into dialogue with those who have different and often opposing viewpoints. So I think this is an important point to make in the move towards the Food Systems Summit. Mike has also made a valid point that we can't try to build resilience in food systems without also considering resilience in other sectors. And and again, this points to a kind of a structural, systemic problem in our societies, and both Karina and Martin alluded to, that is the siloed nature of the majority of our institutions in society that don't really enable that multidisciplinary systems thinking approaches, both in our policy making and beyond. The Minister really, I suppose, reiterated and reminded us that the COVID-19 pandemic has the potential, or is about to roll back decades of progress, but yet on a positive note highlights that the opportunity for the EU-Africa partnerships to refocus on food and rural transformations pathways, including the EU Green Deal, where we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic response. The Minister also reiterated that reaching the furthest behind first is a central plank of the Ireland's overseas development policy, and that's critical for the current COVID crisis, but it'll also be critical for exit, transition and transformation pathways for the years ahead. It's really wonderful to have the National Task Force for Rural Africa launched at the conference today, and this is really a key instrument for charting Ireland's national response and plans for the future. One key conclusion of that report that Tom indicated is that while there's lots of really good work done with the African partners, its work could be better as well, and they can be improved. The work can be improved through the recommendations in the NTTRA report. Leonard highlighted the scale of the challenge to create 1 million jobs per month in Africa, where a lot of the presenters in session 2 have really highlighted the opportunities for Ireland-EU partnerships to help kind of co-create such employment in rural areas and in agri-food value chains. We're delighted that IFIAD is mentioned in the recommendations of the NTTRA report, and we look forward to playing our role in this arena for the future and continue in that regard. I guess a key message from the IFIAD conference to the Food Systems Summit is to use the learning opportunities of the COVID-19 crisis to develop and incentivize through the stimulus packages and social protection food systems that can lead to more sustainable, equitable and resilient outcomes. And a constant, let's say, narrative throughout this entire conference has been really about the need for systems-based approaches, the need for multiple voices, social inclusion, equity considerations, and also for consensus building so that we can get agreement as to what those pathways are. I think today's conference has been really useful in providing a systems connector platform, which is a nice term that people use for both understanding and exchanging learning outcomes arising from the COVID-19 crisis and how they can help to transform our food systems. As the Minister kind of indicated, we should maintain our optimism, continue to build forward better, in the words of Tom, on the food systems transformations are needed. And so, like, on that note, I'd like to thank everybody, the speakers, the organizers and the participants, and at that close the conference and thank everybody and keep up the good work.